Tyler, how are you doing? And Sam, oh my goodness, how are you?
Oh,
How's
good.
everyone
Are you
doing
are you
today?
driving across the state, saving one Uber passenger at a time, Tyler?
That's exactly right.
Oh, good. Oh, good, good.
Yeah, the long trips are the best.
Yes, they are.
I,
That's good. Just like life, right?
yep.
Good. And Sam, how are you doing?
I'm good.
And Sam, what have you, if to put you on the spot, Sam, I'd be curious what you've been thinking about, where your mind has been going these days.
Well, these days, okay, so I've been reading Gerard, Things Hidden Since the Foundation of the World, also Cosmic Connections by Charles Taylor. So I guess my head's sort of like swimming in that milieu. Um, yeah, I think the Gerard thing, I'm really just like once you get a little concept and you put it in front of your eyes and just like look out at your world through it, it's like I'm finding I'm like just observing relationships all the time. Like, is this a rivalry? Are they actually just like just kind of aggressive? Like, and like maybe it, like maybe it's not a bad thing, but yeah, that's kind of what I've been seeing. What about you?
That is lovely. I haven't read Charles Taylor's new book. I'll have to pick it up because I am a big, I've read a lot of him, and his thinking is very, very good. And I'm glad you picked up Gerard. Yeah, it's funny you mentioned that because then it's almost like after you get a theory that has this powerful consistency, you see it everywhere. And in some respects, that's really beneficial. And then in other ways, Cleo kind of says that Gerard takes one example of sacrifice and over expands it to all examples of sacrifice. Yeah. But then at the same time, there seems to be legitimacy, one, to the idea of memetics. Certainly, I think one of the ways I think about it, Mr. Wynn, good to see you, sir, is that memetics also follows from the groundlessness of decision and plausibility structures like Berger talks about. So, for example, if I see everyone around me is buying a truck, it makes me feel more comfortable to buy a truck because there's a kind of social support going on. And although people like Berger and Reef and all of those cats didn't necessarily call it memetics, there is something about human beings that precisely because freedom is abyssal in a way, like if you choose to do something, there's kind of a groundlessness to it. That doesn't mean it's false. That doesn't mean it's true. Doesn't mean anything, but it means it's anxiety producing. If I can look around and be like, others are doing it, then the groundlessness of being, if we use a fancy phrase, and then I'll give it to Phillip, helps support decision. So I can feel more comfortable with it, right? Like if everyone is doing X, I can feel more comfortable to do X. So I do wonder if there's a social existential dimension to mimetic desire that has to be brought into the forefront to help explain why is it that we can, that we kind of mirror what other people are doing, and why, does that necessarily lead to envy and killing one another in Shakespeare plays and different things like that? I'll also note before passing to Phillip, it's funny that you bring up the theory like glasses and seeing it everywhere. I've been revisiting Alfred Korzybski, who wrote a tremendous book called Science and Sanity in the 1930s. And if I were to summarize what's very interesting about Korzybski, and is that he kind of points out is if you were stuck in the symbolic of Roman numerals, you could never do modern mathematics. That the very symbols by which we use to calculate set fences or parameters around what we can think. So it really matters the symbolic that we use. But of course, there's a weird question of how do you decide to use a new symbolic? Where does that come from within a symbolic? That's a weird question. And then second, with that idea of needing the symbolic, there's a way in which theories are kind of like that. Like theories determine the parameters in which you think. And you see, the problem is if theory itself is restricting you from thinking, then the theory will not in its internal consistency let you know that you're doing that, kind of as a girdle point, right? You always have that incompleteness of self-reference where the self-reference can't go, hey, there's something beyond the theory. No theory is going to say Roman numerals don't tell you to move beyond Roman numerals per se, right? A theory does not tell you to move beyond it. Well, maybe that's evidence that you shouldn't move beyond it. Maybe that's evidence that it really is true, or else it's a conspiracy in which you can make the entire world fit no matter what, right? That's always the problem. Like the line between a theory and a conspiracy can be thin sometimes. You know, okay, but how do you tell? And I'm increasingly wondering if a way to think about metaphysics is precisely the awareness of this thing that Korzybski is talking about, where the way that we think about reality is very much structured by the symbolic or the theory or the structure in which we are thinking about reality. And that metaphysics, as this study of concepts, study of categories, is this constant awareness of this need to meta-analyze the theory, so that it doesn't just become something we see everything through. Because there is something unique about Girard in perhaps its power to see everything through it, for good and for bad. I'm not necessarily saying that's bad, but it's interesting that way. So I appreciate you sharing. Let me throw it over to Phillip here. Phillip, it's good to see you. I like your hair. It's so handsome.
You too, Daniel. Good to see you. This reminds me, I mean, you're a human, right? Doesn't he ask this question of like, how can you tell if the door in the desert is real? Like, do you see it and say, okay, it's real? Do you throw a spear at it when you see it land on there? You say it's real, or do you have to touch it with your finger? And then in the Christian metaphysics, of course, it's Thomas who inserts his finger into the side. And this is the one that is, you know, is kind of saying like doubt as a first principle is a good move when grounding epistemology. Sam, I think it's interesting you brought up Charles Taylor. A lot of this, I think, has to do with the social imaginary, and like a lot of the rivalries. I feel like I've been in relationships. It comes down to which lens the person has on. Like if someone is like, no, this is how it is, and someone else is like, no, that's a social imaginary. And then it like gets to the point, like if someone's switching, like all of a sudden it's like, oh no, don't scare the stiffs too much. Not too quickly. You're scaring them. You're scaring. And generally then you just sort of like enter questions like, why do we create these things to ground reality? And you get interesting concepts with death anxiety. Some of these things, I mean, have been around since Socrates, but then furthered by thinkers like Heidegger, thinkers like, what's that guy's name? Ernst Bloch? Baker? Ernest Baker? Sheldon Solomon. And how does that like kind of weave into, yeah, Ernst Becker, that's the dude, the denial of death. Like, how does that weave into the ways that we remain open to some kind of new, some novelty, while still saying, oh, let's not get rid of this thing that has brought us this far. And I think most all of it comes down to taste, or people trying to take authorities and ram them down other people's throats. So it's kind of interesting to see that interplay of Girard with Charles Taylor, and just how often we can have a theoretical framework, and it's sort of like, who was the guy who was like, get married or don't get married, no matter what, you'll regret it. This
Kierkegaard.
Kierkegaard, right? It's like, get lenses or don't get lenses, no matter what, you'll regret it. But then I think after that, how can you kind of move to like a deep pluralistic cosmopolitanism of Byung-Chul Han, where you're still friendly with people, even though you're like, you know, this is insufferable, my God. Still, I'll, you know, I've been playing a lot of ping pong, and there was someone who was pulling me aside, told me this concept called kita choi, and I guess it's big in martial arts. And it's doing things in the spirit of mutual benefit and friendship. So I like that.
Beautiful. I'll pass it to Sam. And as Tyler's driving, I hear the kiss me down by the dun. I like to think that music's playing with the sunlight going through the car. It's really great. A few things quick. It's very interesting because I think actually this is very relevant to relationships, actually. Like the inability to think in different symbolics or frameworks. Michelle and I will talk about meta talks. Then you are stuck in your symbolic and you can't think beyond it. Like let's say you're in a relationship where you need modern mathematics and you only have Roman numerals, you're in huge trouble. And what's very interesting is this question of when do you move to a new symbolic? And I think we see in, like, if we look at Kuhn, there's this encounter of anomalies. There are these anomalies. You keep experiencing something that's your symbolic or your theory or your map. And I should note that Korzybski is, he may have invented the phrase, the map, the map is not the territory. That's where, he at least popularized it. So that's where that comes from, Alfred Korzybski, Science of Sanity. And the whole idea is that, like, if you realize your map is bad when you're walking the territory and you're like, this map says there's a tree and there's not. So this map, I might need a better map. So there's this fascinating interplay between experience and theory, or symbolic, semantic, there's all these different terms. I think there's something very similar to relationships. People have a theory for what a relationship is, and if they are not willing to move to something else when they encounter anomaly, there could be trouble, right? And I think that is relevant to this question of social imagination and getting along, because rather than going, oh, I encountered somewhere where my theory doesn't work, I'll say map, I encountered somewhere where my map doesn't work, therefore there is no truth, therefore nihilism, that doesn't seem correct. Maybe you go, well, maybe there are different maps and different symbolics by which to operate, of which are sublative in relationship. That's the key. Roman numerals is not forsaken or left behind as you move to new symbolics, new structures. They are sublated. They are included in it, right? So there's something about a sublation that is needed in this pluralistic thinking. And the last thing is, I wonder if Girard was great at parties. Like, if he knew about the mimetic stuff, do you think he gained that and became the guy who ran the room? Or did he never go to parties to avoid mimetics, right? Was there a nihilistic Girard? It's like, why even bother going to parties? Because it's just going to be mimetic rivalry. Or did he instead use the awareness of mimetics for the good of the entire party, right? Maybe that's the question, right? How do we use our theories to the benefit of the room, not our simply giving up hope in parties? So it'd be wonderful to know if Girard went to parties. But let me give it to Sam and Mr. Wynn. Sam.
I really love this question of if Girard went to parties and game to mimetic behaviors, because actually it took me a good 20-30 pages before I could really even enjoy the text. I was like, I don't know about this guy. I don't think he's really talking to me. Maybe he's because some authors have an air about them with the way they use their language. I don't know. He felt really stuck in his own groove of terms. Anyways, I don't know, but good question. But yeah, to go back to Girard going way too far sometimes, I really think that he does. That's kind of my main feeling while reading this. I think it's a super useful mechanism to analyze things through. But I don't know, he's got this one quote that I just read, and it was all lyrical metaphors of every age have been can derive from sacred violence. And I was like, man, all of them, all of them, that seems like a lot. But and yeah, I think because he's got this framework and you can see so many things through it. I think actually, because at the same time I'm just jumping between texts, but I'm also reading Closure by Hilary Lawson, who it's just it's an epistemological text, and he just says his theory is that the world is an openness which can be enclosed in ways that begets further levels of enclosure, and but because the world is fundamentally an openness, you can have one enclosure, but you can re-enclose the open phenomena of the world in different ways. And in that way, I kind of think Girard has sort of stumbled upon a scale invariant closure. So with water and in geology, when water is rushing through a river, it will take on the same formations as a little tiny trickle of water from a puddle. And it's called scale invariant phenomena. And I feel Girard has a scale invariant concept where it's you can see it in societies operant, you can see it in individuals and stuff, and you can see it in animals, but and I think because it has that scale invariance. He wants to see it everywhere, but I don't think you can see it everywhere. And I really feel like when I am having relationships with people, there are definitely people with whom I have very little like aggression with, and I just know that we've so like stepped outside of whatever the mimetic rivalrous structure is, which he describes as triangular. And I really thought of it in relation to Charles Taylor, actually, Philip, not because of, it's interesting that you bring up social imaginaries, but I thought about it in Charles' book, The Language Animal. He talks a lot about triangular structures of joint attention. And I think that like this triangular structure is a bit more of a nuanced, it's like a nuanced and maybe more broad, like analogy to what Girard is talking about with this rivalrous triangles. And I think and both of them, interestingly, they both relate to language acquisition and acquisitiveness. But what for Taylor, it's like, you know, like I see the hill as with you seeing it, like you see the hill and I see the hill, and I see you seeing the hill and you see me seeing the hill, and it becomes this triangular structure rather than like I want the hill, you want the hill, like, you know. And it made me think like maybe it's just like this scale invariant like concept of rivalrous structures is just like limited to a kind of enclosedness of like some sort of salience game. Like Wittgenstein has language games, but I see like the desire thing that Girard is on, it just feels like a certain sort of like saliency that we could approach the world with, but I don't think we always do.
No, that's magnificent. I think this idea of the scale invariance and also salience is very, very good. There seems to be, maybe a way I would put it, there seems to be conditions in which what Girard is describing becomes a useful map for what is going on. The question is, can you explain, like when you talk about the foundations of the earth according to a certain sacred violence that overturns the mechanisms by which societies operated in history, maybe, you know, there's an argument to be made that I was speaking with Ebert that Christ didn't overturn the scapegoat mechanism. In fact, it like spread it more than ever before as a model. It is now the ethical model by which everyone follows. And you can say, now, I don't know if Girard would say, well, I wasn't saying that the scapegoat mechanism would go away. I was saying that its effectiveness to found a society would go away. Maybe it seems like we form many social communities with scapegoats, right versus left. You know, if we get rid of those people, it would be good. I wonder, one of the things I think about in Girard, without claiming any sort of world, you know, I'm not going to claim any sort of like massive grasp of every intricacy of Mr. Girard. Ah, beautiful Clayton. Look at that guy. He's so beautiful. I wonder if one of the things I think about is if what's missing from Girard is a bit of fear as a mechanism of control. There's a lot of envy. There's a lot of like desire wanting to be mimetic, but looking through history, there's a lot more fear. There's a lot more, you know, kind of this idea that it's not, I don't know, like does scapegoat describe the enemy or the hordes at the gate? Like, is it a scapegoat mechanism, the hordes at the gate that you're unifying the people against? That doesn't seem to be the case, because the scapegoat seems to be more in Girard, a public figure. There's a public execution. There are certain rituals. Maybe you could call the hordes at the gate the scapegoat. Maybe the threat of the other is the scapegoat. But it becomes, there's a lot of nuance there that varies. There doesn't seem to be one kind of scapegoat at the very least, right? There doesn't seem one kind of political project by which to approach the scapegoat. And at that point you say, well, then it's not a scapegoat. Well, then notice what we're doing. We're having to kind of massage the theory to fit into more and more circumstances and so on and so forth. I definitely think, though, there is something like the mimetics, because as soon as a child picks up one toy, the other kid suddenly wants it. And until then, they never wanted it. And maybe, you know, maybe actually what we need to do is when two of our children are doing that, we'll take the third one and put him in its room. And, you know, that will then make them feel like, oh, justice has been certain, they won't want the toy anymore. I don't know, right? Do we need to triangulate it with have 3 kids and we can always like replicate this? Maybe. I didn't think about that. I'll pass it to Mr. Wynn. The other thing I'm thinking about with the closure openness is very good. I think also, like, I've been going down a rabbit hole because I was putting up chairs at the venue, and I came across a thinker named, who I did not know about, Stuart Kauffman, who is quite, I knew about him in biology. I knew about him in theories of emergence, but I didn't know he did cosmology. And the reason I bring this up is because he wants to argue, and this is pretty wild, that non-locality is fundamental, and that space-time and general relativity are special cases within a fundamental non-locality. Now, I'm not going to expand on what that means yet. I'm happy to in a bit, but what it would mean is that extremely consistent systems like general relativity are probably not entirely false, but they may fit within certain conditions. And if you try to expand general relativity, you find yourself in problems of quantum gravity that have to make quantum mechanics equal general relativity, and you get all sorts of anomalies with that, right? Like, you know, a good example is they discovered recently that I think they call them impossible galaxies, are way bigger than they should be given how young they are. This it hasn't reached 5 sigma, which is I think the magic number where then it's science. But it's a lot of data is building to show that there are lots of impossible universes. Well, that's a major crisis then for quantum loop theories, right? And yet it seems wrong to say that general relativity is false, right? But it seems to not be fundamental. I think something similar may apply to Girard, where there seems to be cases in which it is, because it is a powerfully consistent system, that would give you reason to think that it has conditions that apply, but the error seems to be making it fundamental, as in it is a fundamental description, regardless scale that you are describing. Let me pass it to Mr. Wynn. But actually the friggin' non-locality stuff is pretty nuts that Mr. Stuart Kauffman is talking about. It's the first theory I've talked, and he's apparently friends with Lee Smolin, who makes time fundamental, and, you know, Smolin's like my dude. So let me give it to Mr. Wynn. Mr. Wynn, I know.
Let me come 2 minutes.
All right, I'll talk about non-locality for a minute. So what is non-locality in physics? Because, okay, and this is really important. So in quantum like entanglement is the idea that if one quantum way over here is up, then another quantum over here is down. And the reason this is called non-locality, now critically, quantum entanglement does not mean a quantum is in 2 places of space-time at the same time. That's some interpretations of it. And maybe there's a Copenhagen interpretation that goes away. I'm not 100% sure, but really more so what it is that a particle 3 million miles away can move, and simultaneously a particle 3 million miles away can move down. Because the way it works is that if a particle goes up, the other particle goes down, and vice versa. They have this kind of inverse relationship. The reason why this is what Einstein called spooky science is because nothing travels faster than the speed of light. So there should be no way that these things can change at the exact same time, because there's not enough speed. There's no signal, okay? So locality is when 2 things can send each other a signal. They're local, they're in contact, right? Local does not mean like in the same room. You could be 1 million miles away, but you can contact one another. You can have a signal reach one another within a sequence of space-time that is within the speed of light, okay? Like anything that can reach one another within the speed of light would be considered local, okay? So non-locality would be interaction that cannot be described through local forces, ergo faster than the speed of light, which quantum mechanics does, which is weird. And that would be quantum entanglement, okay? So basically what Stuart Kauffman is arguing, that's pretty brilliant, and of course it could be entirely false, just like all of these beautifully consistent cathedrals that are really convincing. But what he argues is basically the following. So non-locality, if you make it fundamental, you have to believe that a possibility is fundamental. Like, so let's take the Schrodinger's cat thing, where a cat is alive and dead at the same time. That's impossible, right? Where Stuart says, but the idea that a cat is possibly alive and possibly dead at the same time is not a contradiction, right? That's correct. You can have possibilities without the problem of the excluded middle, right? And he says, so what if possibility was real? Like possibility was real, which then we could associate, of course, with one of our favorite subjects, lack. Thomas Jockin, lack is not nothing. Lack is fundamental, right? Okay, non-locality. All right, well, without going through Mr. Kauffman's entire theory, if non-locality is fundamental, non-locality from a quantum vacuum can actually give you particles that can gradually build upon one another without ever collapsing into a black hole, which is a huge problem they have in physics. Because if the universe started as a singularity, there's always this question of, well, why didn't it collapse into a black hole, right? You know, because it was such a dense matter, it should have just collapsed into a black hole. So there's always been a problem of singularity in physics. Well, this theory would actually get you through that because you never have a dense singularity of matter. You have a duration of particles arising through non-locality that never collapse because they never form that problem, right? So then what ends up happening is the theory would say non-locality can get you to space. What it would do, this is the other key, is non-locality, and Mr. Wynn, feel free to jump in at any point. Just scream at the top of your lungs or we'll start the band. Non-locality creates matter, okay? And space-time arises from matter versus matter be in space-time. That's the difference. So matter creates space-time, and then in space-time, general relativity is true. And what this does, the reason why this theory is pretty remarkable, is one, it would seem to make something like time fundamental, but not sequential time, more like a durational time, because there has to be some duration for non-locality to occur. The reason why this is remarkable, because what he's doing in this theory is instead of saying quantum mechanics equals general relativity, what he's trying to say is that quantum mechanics in non-locality arises to matter in which general relativity applies. And so you have more of an emergent structure of which would help you avoid all of the anomalies in science that are now creating all of these massive problems, right? All you have to do is make non-locality fundamental. If you do that, if you say that spooky science, the spooky action of quantums, is actually the most fundamental, you can arise to all of these emergent properties and avoid all of the dilemmas and anomalies of quantum gravity. If this was true, that would be pretty wild. And also it would kind of suggest that lacks do in fact have ontology. And in fact, any sort of metaphysics that wants to say potential is real and any sort of way of life that aligns with potentiality might actually be aligning more with actuality. That's why so often in the net, we come back to these various praxis that seem to align with lack and beauty and all these other things, because that actually would align with a reality where non-locality is fundamental, which would also, I think, start getting into, you would start also bringing in Bergson's metaphysics and Whitehead with duration and time, and it seems to make a lot of sense there. But Mr. Wynn, do you get it? Yes?
Okay, I shall sing slowly.
Good.
I missed everything about the science, and as someone who's semi-interested in science, I feel like I could learn a lot. The only thing that I'm always aware of, and I think this is what's interesting, kind of what I got from what you said, because I was also running around the room looking for this webcam, is basically that it's nice when science can kind of double back upon itself and include in its own analysis the very non-locality of its position, of what it's studying. And I think that's probably why people are interested in quantum physics. Yeah, it's like introducing this kind of more nuanced perspective about how we understand truth through the scientific lens. And I think in that sense, it's nice when, like Charles Taylor, or maybe not Girard, because I don't know his philosophy well enough, when philosophy or science becomes a bit more critical towards itself and its ability. And I think it's a very modern trait, like a very modern postmodern trait, is to become very skeptical. And Charles Taylor, there was somebody I knew who wrote on the guy I'm interested in, Vatimo. So he talks about like the secularization of religion through the lens of Charles Taylor and Vatimo. If anybody's interested, I think, and his work was really good in this world, because it talks about how we have to be aware that our theories or representations that we think are attaining the truth of the actuality, they are just maps in that sense. You know, they're kind of historically formed maps that somehow miss out on something which is kind of excessive to the map in some way. And again, that's very postmodern. For anybody that knows that, like, that's kind of was my interest in a way, is that sort of philosophy which becomes or uses its language to question its language, like deconstruction, you know, like you construct narratives around the very idea that within each narrative there's an impossibility, but you're using that narrative to talk about the narrative and the fact that the narrative is impossible. And it's very circular, it's very repetitive, you know. Like Zizek critiques its repetitiveness because it would say it's just like its own jouissance, like it's enjoying its own failure. So a lot of thinkers like to think about different ways of approaching truth. And I think maybe this is where science is coming in to say, well, we can think both in some way, you know. Like within the gaps of theories, there's a way to think that and prove that. And then you can ontologize lack actually at that point. But my initial comment that I kind of put the hand up for was talking about relationships, like the interchange of narratives, and like if there's an impossibility in each moment when like two people have the like I forgot who said it, like the lens, like the way you can see one situation through two different lenses without the ability to realize that that lens is one lens among many or multiple. That's when there's problems, you know. That's when there's kind of like impossibility, like inconceivability. You can't bring those narratives together. You can't bring those ideas. And I think in that sense, like that's kind of true with every narrative that we use in our particular existence. Like the way I understand the net compared to everybody here will always be different based upon our own historical ideas, our own mood, our own desire, our own reading, our own place, our own language, you know. But I think what's nice is how philosophy can also approach those gaps and inconsistencies. So I just looked online, like Charles Taylor is in that sense kind of following Heidegger, Merleau-Ponty and Heidegger and Hegel, because he became bored of analytical philosophy at the point that it wouldn't question. That's why I was reading for 30 seconds at the beginning, like because he wasn't able to see in analytical philosophy a kind of critique of the groundlessness of the grounds they presuppose. So exactly, yeah, didn't we all? Exactly, especially in England as well. Yeah, because you realize it doesn't question the groundlessness of the grounds or even the ground of the ground, which makes you, and that's the deeper modern postmodern philosophy, is it questions it. So then what I've seen is like Charles Taylor talks about the pre-understanding, how our understandings, our narratives are always grounded upon something which actually can't be kind of signified. Semiotics, like it can't, there's something which kind of remains outside or exterior, like the non-rational in that sense. But my point, and I think this again is where philosophy is coming to today, is it is actually trying to think about the groundlessness of our narratives and our horizons and the even like, yeah, the moment by moment understanding that we each of us have towards things. Philosophy is not just saying, oh, there is a lack beneath each narrative, or there is a kind of nothingness behind each narrative. But actually it's questioning the quality of thinking, how we think that. And I think, for example, like it came up in last week's the net. So from a friend, I'm learning about Leibniz's idea of beauty, his idea of beauty, and his true beauty is on the behalf of the person who's experiencing life or the work of art or a beautiful moment, in the sense that beauty lies on the behalf of how that person relates to that experience. It's not about the content of the specific moment. It's about the personal kind of subjective experience of that, and that's where objective beauty is. It's about the way you relate to it. It's about your openness to it. And this goes to like the word Philip was using, like the openness. And I think there's truth to openness in that precise sense. I think in relationships, there's truth to openness. There's truth to being open with somebody. There's truth to being open with your own position and being skeptical towards yourself, because that then introduces this concept of let be. You start to let things be, and that's a new truth. That's a new way of relating to things. So I just made a comment. It's not simply the interchange, and so to use the word Daniel used, like sublation of narratives, and then they've said like the horizon we use to make sense of a specific situation, and or even of being good at holding a meta conversation. That's a nice way to say it. But to find truth in a quality of relating to each narrative, whereby truth is found in the open quality that remains left over. And I think that's actually something we can think, and we can use a narrative to push ourselves towards in some way. And then what remains is an openness which remains open. And this is when Sam commented again about the openness of enclosures. So actually there is a way to think enclosures, like historical enclosures, and be open towards them, knowing they're historical. But I think at that point, there's also an openness to know that you're experiencing an opening. And that's phenomenology, actually. That's what that means in some sense, is like you're kind of taking a step back from ontology and metaphysics, knowing that you can't theorize the absolute truth, but then in a way you kind of have a phenomenological theory in some sense. and you can hang out there a little bit, I think. And there's something about the quality of that I think is true in that sense. So yeah, the only truth is not the content of a theory's positing or its mapping onto the terrain, but that theory which centers on the open quality of each and every possible theory. And I think that's where like spirituality kind of comes in at that point. It's like how you relate to your own self-identity. It's not the truth of the image that you have of your own ego. It's the relation you have to your ego, knowing that it's kind of historically produced and not just like denying it. Like I watched a 20-second clip today of Eckhart Tolle, and he's like, yes, for 3 years I didn't think. Or like he was in this constant state of like openness in a way. And I was like, yeah, sounds cool. Like sounds nice. And I was like, oh, I've had these moments, but I wouldn't say he's not thinking. I would just say he's gaining a different relationship to thinking. Like I don't think you stop thinking ever. So when I hear people like trying to attain this state of not thinking, I'm like, maybe it's about the way we relate to thinking. It's about the way we relate to this image that we produce of ourselves, you know? It's not the destruction of that, because then you're attaining a problem that Heidegger knew, the willing of non-willing. You're willing not to will, but then you're caught in this willing of not willing, so it's still willing. And I think that's where a lot of people get burnt out with spirituality, religion, is they're trying to attain it, you know? They're trying to attain the good news, they're trying to attain God's approval, they're trying to attain the thing. But then I think this is why Heidegger's nice and other people, is like you don't have to attain it. Like you're fine, you know? Like you don't have to attain the correct theory, even scientifically. But then I guess science is quite playful because you say, well, why not? If we have these tools at our disposal, we can use them and actually we can gain some knowledge, I think, whilst knowing that there's cracks and inconsistencies. And that's Thomas Kuhn, Kuhn, like the fact that each narrative that we have of science towards the world will have cracks and inconsistencies, and two different theories can say that's different things about the same phenomena. And I think this is where my naivety around quantum physics is, because I think quantum is doing something where it's kind of starting to bridge those theories. So that's where Daniel comes back in. Please continue.
I claim no expertise on that field. So, you know, but I appreciate it. A few things. First off, I'll give it to Sam. I really hope that Clayton's like taking his kids to school and they're like, Daddy, what's going on? And just listen, kids. You know, they're gonna make a track. There's gonna be a band soon. One thing, metaphorically, I do wonder if there's something about groundlessness that is, you know, like the groundlessness of narratives, if we could almost, at least metaphorically, almost talk about the non-locality of narratives. And there is something about, actually, when you come to terms with groundlessness, that is an opening to the other, right? That is also, it seems to increase people's capacity to experience the other person because they're not so enclosed. I know I'm being metaphoric here, but there is something interesting about groundlessness in this positive project way that kind of, at least metaphorically, has some sort of mapping with non-locality. Like there is some sort of connection that occurs. Now, maybe it's a spooky and maybe it's overly metaphoric, but it is interesting because if Kauffman is correct, nothingness is more like lack. It's more like a fundamental non-locality out of which this spooky action occurs that cannot be understood in sequential time. And Kauffman's theory, in a kind of Kuhnian sense, sure as heck does deal with a lot of anomalies, which tends to give it some, you know, check marks. Last thing I'll say is I think it's really important to realize that in religions, humility, like let's say Christianity, humility was not like thinking. It was not thinking of as Joseph Prince once said, is not thinking of yourself as less, but thinking of yourself less. Like humility is a negation, not a insulting. Like that's where we've gotten in a lot of trouble. I think there's like humility as a virtue can be associated with this kind of letting be, as opposed to, but then of course, it would be an entirely different subject. Humility as thinking of self as less then leads to a certain theology that can be very problematic of the Roman road, as opposed to thinking of self less, which then more aligns with, say, sainthood, Simone Weil, beauty, and other things. But so humility could be connected with these points on letting and negation. But let me give it to Miss Sam Willem. Miss Willem, please.
Yeah, I wanted to tie what you were saying about non-locality together with what Thomas was saying also about groundlessness. So that makes a lot of sense. And actually, to tie it back to Gerard, the whole thing made me think of a quote that I'd read recently and taken notes on. He's like describing how as a mimetic rivalry sort of intensifies, the desire for the object becomes greater and greater. And he says like this process of transfiguration, which is to say that like increasing desire as the object is withheld, nothing about the object actually changes. It doesn't become more valuable, you know, but in any material sense. Yeah, it doesn't actually correspond to anything real, and yet it transforms the object into something that, and the way he puts it is as appears super abundantly real. And then he goes on to say that this could be described as metaphysical in character. We could be well to describe the word desire only, or we could be well to use the word desire only in circumstances where this mimetic rivalry has imbued not just an appetite or a need for something, but it's been given this metaphysical desire where it's able to like appear to us again like as super abundantly real. I think those kind of like concepts of like excess of being relate to this, I don't know, like phenomena of perception. And I think, yeah, it also kind of relates to what Thomas you were saying about pre-understandings as Charles Taylor talks about it in his wider conception of language. And I think this kind of relates sort of like to the work of Thomas Moynihan and spinal catastrophism. He's like, it's a weird book, but like I think he's kind of like describing the like the body as an evolutionary process of like forgetting prior pre-understandings into a body that just like automatically creates those pre-understandings as perception. And I found that really interesting about Girard. It's like, yeah, like what if like desire, which I don't really ignite in myself in any way, I don't pre-code desire into me, and yet I experience it. It's sort of like, you know, it really defines my life. It pulls me towards the things that I go towards. And, you know, it does that also for the whole species. And so like, and yet it's just this sensation. It's this sense. It's like felt drawing. And it's like, you know, it's like my body is sort of like made of that desire, which is oriented towards the super abundantly real, which is like, I don't know, kind of crazy. But yeah, I also just wanted to say, like, when it comes to spirituality, I really like what you were saying, Daniel, about forgetting the self rather than just like sort of abusing it. Like, and sometimes I find like, for me personally, I do enjoy meditation and I get a lot out of meditation, but when it comes to like a lot of more of my like modern neuroses, I find prayer in the more traditional sense to be a lot more helpful, because honestly, just like petitioning for somebody else is really transformational. Like you completely cuts that like that Byung-Chul Hollian self-exploitative self-creating, like that exhaustive self-becoming. It's like God, you're just like always trying to be yourself. But then if you just stop and you just like think like, oh, what about this person? They have some problems. Maybe I should focus on them. Maybe I should hope for them. Maybe I should orient all of my attention and just perception to them for a little bit. And when you do, it's like, oh, it's relaxing. It's like such a relief.
Beautiful. And it makes me think what you were just saying right there. There's something about prayer. Well, first off, you know, there's this $1 million question. Okay, if non-locality is fundamental, is it still somehow present? Like, or did it just end at the beginning of the universe, right? Like, there's this big question. If non-locality is in fact fundamental, and to some degree still with us, even within space-time, in glimmers or underlying it somehow, well, that opens that opens a whole lot of questions on a whole lot of stuff about what prayer does, what all of these things are doing, how humans relate, self as field. Man, we can even start talking about Seldrick, because that's always fun, how dogs just know when you're coming home and stuff. I mean, all of that opens. All of that friggin' opens. And also to the Zizek quote is interesting because it makes me think of Owen Barfield and the other individual who I like, whose name escapes me until I stop trying to think about it, because that's how it works. When you stop trying to think about it, you move to the open from the enclosed, and then you're in non-locality and the potential can come forth like particles. Also, it is kind of funny that the way he describes particles coming from the quantum vacuum does seem to be like memory works, where you just kind of perfs up. And now, you know, I don't know at what point I'm being metaphoric versus scientific, but let me put it this way. At the beginning, we were saying one's thinking is very much bound to the symbolic you use, right? Like what you can think and what you cannot is bound to the symbolic, the map that you have. Non-locality is fundamental, opens up thinking in areas that otherwise were closed in perhaps problematic ways, perhaps ways that kept us sane. Because once you open up and start talking about consciousness and dogs and birds and Celtic stuff, maybe you go mad. I don't know. But maybe actually, well, the stakes are actually quite high on Korzybski's point, because he says that basically he calls his book Science and Sanity. And by science, he's thinking the symbolic science. He's basically saying the following: if you have the wrong theory or the wrong map, you will go crazy. Like if you're trying to do if you find yourself in the modern world needing modern mathematics, and you won't allow yourself to do that because all of the institutional powers or your own Stockholm syndrome keeps you in Roman numerals, you will go crazy. So the stakes are quite high. It's not like, I think after all of the religious wars, it was like stick to science because theology and all that's too dangerous. That's true, it is dangerous. But avoiding that is also dangerous, because if you get stuck in a map that's too closed and you encounter anomalies that you can't think, it can lead to all sorts of mental health issues. Now, he didn't have, like, it's pretty wild. Korzybski is writing all of this long before basically the mental health crisis that is coming out now. And he's basically like, yeah, we're not able to think symbolic, so we're probably going to have some major mental health crises coming up. Yeah, well, good job, Alfred. You know, and so it's fascinating. So the stakes are quite high. But what I was going to say is what you're saying about prayer there and self-forgetfulness. It's very interesting. I think it's Galatians that says something like everything that is created is good if approached in a spirit of thanksgiving. Which actually the converse of that is to suggest that a lack of thanksgiving makes everything bad. And I do wonder if the opposite of burnout is thanksgiving, and that thanksgiving is also tied to this ability to move beyond the ego, right? It's just, but there's also a danger where powers that be tell you to be grateful, so you accept the status quo, and then you're in trouble, right? So there's a danger. You don't want to overfit the symbolic of thanksgiving, but this is why beauty seems important, because there's some connection where you're not just thankful that, you know, you can work 12 hours a day and barely scrape by, because then the power structure is weaponizing Thanksgiving against you. But there's also a danger where you don't have Thanksgiving at all, because then you can't be open, you're overly enclosed. And if you can't be open, you can't experience beauty. And if you're overly enclosed, then you're in burnout or nihilism or all sorts of trouble. But that flexibility right there, that ability to move between structures given the situation, that's all what Alfred Korzybski is talking about. And that of itself would be what you would perhaps more so expect in a world or universe where non-locality is fundamental. The very fact that you have to move like that and consider different potentials and actualize them, open them and actualize them, that would be fitting for a universe where non-locality is more fundamental than just locality. Because the reason for that is because our very way of experiencing things then has an influence on how they unfold. Like relations are ontological then, basically, at the end of the day, and yet the relations cannot be reduced to sequences in space-time. That's the crazy thing. Like if non-locality is fundamental, then there are relations that are fundamental that are not understandable within the speed of light in sequence. Therefore, we're getting into quite a wild place, and therefore therefore the map we use impacts the territory we experience. Well, that's a fun one. And the territory we experience affects the maps that we have. And so you're always already in the game, if you will. But let me pass it to Mr. Shinn and then Clayton. Mr. Shinn.
Well, being a non-local bag chaser, I've lived in a lot of metropolitan cities, and Thanksgiving for us is Friendsgiving. And I think, like, luckily, kick it up a notch, double time. It's possible that human thought is faster than the speed of time, or the speed of light, which could probably both bring you to like an unfun and a more fun madness, maybe what they used to call divine madness. But as far as, I'm wondering just how much we have to sort of divide the subject. Like, I recently was having a conversation with my uncle, and like everything he was saying was super true as a bag chaser, And I was just like, oh, you're chasing a bag. Got it. Like, that's probably like a decent, decent strat. But I was like, but that's certainly not like what's going on, as far as, I don't know, just existentially. Um, and he was almost like, well, what's the point of thinking about that? And I think to cultivate in yourself a spirit of thankfulness for the problems of prosperity, you probably have to be in the top 10%, let's just say round number of uh the world's, material conditions to start seeing that the symbolic is what's the problem. Oh, it's this. But to be thankful, and also I think like part of the Thanksgiving is dealing with the fact that there might not be as much precedent as other areas of thinking that might get you more, let's say, highly esteemed in social circles. Uh, so it's like I know that there are some people using philosophy to chase a bag, and they'll be like, sort of thinking like Netflix writers, like, I need to get to a point in this piece where, the catharsis for this type of demographic will hit instead of just like incomprehensibility and then sell a bunch when you're dead. Uh, so I think that as far as the kind of balance and the movement toward uh, ways of thinking outside of, because I know Girard's not like a reductionist to the market. I know he's not like, oh, I'm like the rival. He has a bunch of um, further areas of life he applies it to. Um, I am just like a lot of the theories outside of like traditional religions, honestly, that, top of mind are able to account for unprovoked, let's call it human malice, but like very few seem to have anything to say about like unprovoked kindness, like unprovoked acts of good. And then you're like, oh, well, I'll just go to the media to look for that. There's nothing. It's like I'll just go, like I'll walk around my, uh, I'm sure it's happening a lot here, and like, uh, just where you see, um, but it's, I don't know. I don't know how. It's like kind of tough to recognize sometimes, even when it's happening, because it's like contingent to the person's journey, where for someone when they're 7, they might have the ability to affect geopolitical injustice, whereas someone in their 70s might be, for the first time, coming to the realization that some of the things that they do affect other people in ways that they have never yet considered. So I guess that's like, in a way, like kind of openness gets tested by like repulsion. It's like something that's like so like, ugh. Uh, and how to kind of, not allow your constant desire to secure your future well-being to like blur or block your vision from seeing things like this.
No, I think it's tremendous. I'll give it to Clayton here. I think that ties to this question, like we were talking about last week, on the idea of how to have your story of your life unfold versus pouring from the top, right? Like that's the Andrew Lubin we were talking with, the beloved William Wilson, who says good literature doesn't pour in from the top. They're not merely a inciting incident that causes a character to go on. There is a fundamental logic underlying what happens at the beginning that unfolds through the work, not poured in to keep the action going, right? And so likewise, there's a kind of idea of what is the principle in operation in your life always already that you are unfolding as you live. And that brings the future and the present together. And you could even say kind of non-locally then, because you're influencing what is there here. That's in a way, and again, I'm at this point making it more metaphoric probably than scientific. There's this idea that literally what you do in the present does instantaneously affect the future, right? Like in the virtual, there is a kind of non-locality going on there. And so if you can indeed interact with the now in a manner that has an unfolding theme, then you are shaping the future while simultaneously being thankful for the present, but not in a manner that makes you complacent and enclosed in the present. That seems to be the trick. Like there's a gratitude that makes you enclosed in the present, right? But then there's a orientation to the future that makes you enclosed in the future. And that doesn't seem good. So this is where narrative structure seems really, really important. The problem is maybe the enclosure to the future is more dangerous because it seems open. Like it seems open. I'm open to what could occur, but you have a certain idea of what it's going to look like. And also you're actually, as you're paying attention to the future in a manner that's pouring in from the top, you're actually enclosing yourself more in the present because you're not going to get there, because you're not unfolding the story. It's actually hindering your capacity to realize difference, right? So this is where thinking life in terms of a better narrative structure, like Andrew and Alex's book, is extremely important. Or otherwise, we simply go about looking for inciting incident after inciting incident, and that is either at the expense of the present or the future, and nothing ever unfolds from it. So I think it's a tremendous question. I mean, the other thing too, I think like when I think about mimetic desire, I do sometimes wonder if it's more so a kind of existential account. Like, so for example, if you have, Thomas Hammerich will talk about global networks where if you're in a third world nation and you're poor and you see first world nations, there's a sense that you desire it and this could lead to geopolitical corruption. I wonder sometimes if it's more of like an existential account, like why is it that we're poor and they're not? Is that mimetic desire, or is it a sense of justice? Is it a sense of what is the account to explain why the world is the way that it is? Because it doesn't seem fair. Like, and there's a way in which if there's a lack of symmetry between nations, I need an existential account to explain that. But then of course you'd have to go through geopolitics, history, and natural resources and economics and all of these different things. And I do wonder if actually existential accounts can sometimes, because like when I encounter, say, people who maybe would make up like they're angry at the elites, they feel like their jobs are out of the country, they don't feel like they can get ahead, I don't detect a lot of envy. It's more like what's the reason for this? Like it's like I can't, no matter how much of work, I can't get ahead, right? There's a feeling of you can't get there. Is that mimetic desire, or is that an existential account in that sense, right? So there's like, I want an existential account for why this is occurring or why this is the way that it is. And so again, it can be mimetic. I actually wonder if mimetic desire applies a lot more to status. Like you have status, I want status, like power in different things, and I want to have that mimetic sort of desire. When it comes to economics and goods, I wonder if it actually more often falls into existential account than envy. There can be envy, but I do wonder if existential account, as I'm just terming it here, can be a role. And now I want to talk about, now I'm tempted to talk about, you talked about symbolics, inadequate symbolics, and then I think about Owen Barfield and things like that, because there could be this evolution of consciousness through time, which is pretty wild. But let me give it to Mr. Clayton.
Lovely to see you all. And this non-locality makes me think about how we all like to refer to thinking in the head. Like everyone will always kind of like in my mind, in my head, to my mind. But essentially it's like the brain and the neurological system is localized, and it's like while you're thinking in your head, your hand is anticipating what it needs to do next, your feet are anticipating what they need to do, and they're taking actions. Like they have their own local universe in which they are acting, and it's like even the whole body as a unit does not behave as one local entity. It's still subdivided in, it's multidimensional, and it's like, yeah, this whole concept, it sort of like brought me to remember that, and it's quite fascinating when you start to think about it that way, because it's as if there's always, it's like there's a never-ending chaotic emergence always happening, and we're always trying to orient to it in some way that makes sense. And I think this whole, linear approach, like the scientific linear approach, is just trying to find a thread that we can use as a standard, a sense-making standard, amidst all the chaos that's emerging and unfolding at the same time. And sometimes I think we attribute too much to that. It's like we attribute that linear thread, we give it too much credit and hold it up and try to aspire to it without really accounting for how much of the chaos there is. And when you actually take a step back to account for how much the chaos, you start to find that linear thread, the abnormality. It's like, oh, okay, so there's a million ways this could go, and this is just one of them. Like Thomas was saying before. So I think I'm very much in agreement with that. I think when you start to spread out the thought along all the other chaotic elements that could emerge in the moment, it then changes. And then I think then it puts you in wonder, kind of like, the prayer aspect, like, what someone was saying, like the moment you shift the attention from you, then all of a sudden you see how wide it is. Like, well, you don't have to commit to that linear thread. Now you have multiple options. But yeah, good to see everyone. I'll pass it back.
Well, as always, you are saying to be here at 5 a.m. and it's the ultimate alarm clock. That's perfect. And it's like, Dad, why do you wake us up to this? Because it will make you wake up. So you'll go. But no, I think that's all brilliant. Well, it makes me think, on this idea, because there's almost like possibility can break through and you can escape the linear, right? And so again, if non-locality is fundamental, and therefore matter creates space-time versus space-time be in which matter occurs, and thus general relativity describes what occurs within the space-time that matter arises to, then you have these certain anomalies that arise in space-time, like, string theory is trying to account for why there are impossible galaxies. It also should be noted, very important, in 2022, the Nobel Prize went to basically a physicist who closed the final loophole on non-locality. So non-locality exists. You can't say it doesn't. It is a real thing that occurs in the quantum realm. So that was a big discovery in 2022, and everyone is panicking because, oh my gosh, we have to explain this. And also it would mean that theories of supersymmetry have to somehow account for non-locality. That just screws everything up. So, there are these crises. But what's very interesting is another word for these crises could be, it makes me think of when Charles Taylor talks about enchantment. When the world used to be enchanted before modernity. One of the ways I think about enchantment is the possibility of something breaking through. You're in the forest and at any moment there might be a fairy. You're in the church and at any moment God might show up. There's always a possibility of something breaking through, right? And that's kind of the enchantment. Now, it's very interesting because when you read your old fairy tales, they're sometimes terrifying, right? An enchanted world is not necessarily a world where the cave is going to be a place where something good comes out of it. It could be terrifying. But enchantment has this sort of, there's some possibility of something coming through, right? And you could almost see the speculative real of a Quentin Malissou or different, like after finitude, this trying to return to this possibility of something breaking through. Because at any moment, if contingency is ultimately radical, the universe could change, the dead really could rise, God could come into existence, right? That's what the speculative realist, I believe, will talk about, right? But there's this hunger for this possibility of something breaking through at any moment, and that returns enchantment. Well, then these anomalies, what if we look at these anomalies as physics, as these enchantable breakthroughs where, there really is enchantment. There really is a point where the map is wrong. and something can break through, right? And then beautifully, if in fact non-locality is ultimately fundamental, and that somehow locality is participating in non-locality, then maybe there are possibilities for various breakthroughs at any single moment, but it's no longer a mystical enchantment, but one that's based on a fundamental non-locality. So maybe there's a certain hope that can come from that, because thinking is faster than the speed of light. And then I do think it creates a certain hope, because that theory would necessarily make potential real. And so when you're considering new potentials in a relationship or a way of life, and then I'll give it to Phillip here, you're not just daydreaming. You're not just fantasy, because that's always what we feel like. Potential is kind of lower than the real, right? Like potential is, oh, you're just trying to avoid the real. You're just trying to avoid what's in front of you. No, I'm trying to think about new ways to unfold what is in front of me so that we can actually have a thematic story versus just pouring in. Most relationships are just inciting incident after inciting incident, right? They're bad stories. How do we, in fact, structure it to be following the command of a theme, to be the unfolding of a situation, to use Mr. Luber and Alex's work, and that would also have a Heideggerian structure to it, the letting of things coming. Well, if potential are real, you can, we talked about last week that letting is the opposite of pouring in this narrative structure. Well, yeah, you can let, because there's potential that is active, and it should be noted that Stuart Kauffman says that Aristotle, there is, as Jockin talks about all the time, potentials are real because they're in lack. It's an Alfred Whitehead. We see it in Bergson. We see this is the notion. Well, potentials have a creativity. In Alfred Whitehead, creativity, you could almost say in a capital C, is, most fundamental. Well, yeah, then we can let. The story is to let that creativity move forth. And I think, and that changes things. There's a certain enchantment that is possible with that. But let me give it to Mr. Phillip Shinn and then Mr. Thomas Wynne. Phillip Shinn.
Well, breaking through is an apt symbol for the dimethyltryptamine psychedelic journey. Often the first phase is a blasting off and then a breaking through. And I know that the work of Carl Hayden Smith with his DMT-X, he talks about one of the things he felt was that he was in 8 different consciousnesses at the same time. And his Carlness, was just the one that was most familiar. So much so that he was like in some like African woman's body. The body was pregnant. He was in the fetus. He was in a table, and just experiencing like all of these things through the ingestion of a molecule that's naturally occurring in the pineal gland. And there are different, I say more and more like we're becoming a society scared of the dark. This is why people are looking at their phones all the time. It's just scared of the dark. And there are, certain countries or whatever cultures that would leave their children in a cave, like mostly for the first 16 or 18 years of their life. And their DMT production was like that of, people going through NDEs, like in a regular thing. And they would have no problem being like, oh yeah, we see the sprites, we see the fairies. Do you see like the master of the woods over there? And the Westerner would be like, I just see trees. And I wonder how much of this is like what you were saying, kind of placing your attention outside of yourself, this addiction we have to interiority, that I think could stem from just like profound boredom. So you like go ahead and create this whole like, I am someone who buys FUBU or whatever. I am someone who likes Chick-fil-A. I am, et cetera, et cetera. As a result of technology allowing our lives to be so comfortable. And I think this is what some of Heidegger's problem with technology was. He was just like, it's going to only allow people to understand a certain technical use of language. And anyone else that comes in is just going to be scapegoated. They're just going to be like, hey, what you're doing, that's like I'm going to be like the syntax lawyer. And like, nobody listen to that person because it's not within the, acceptable language game. And when you're speaking of the enchantment, I feel so often like the move is actually this re-enchantment or something like this. It's just like I don't remember everything what it was like as a kid, but when I'm around kids, they seem to just be like, "Yep, yep," you know. And is that something that's kind of taught out of us? Can it come back? And how much of it has to do with kind of the interiority that keeps us at a certain cadence. I think frankly has been manufactured just to make us buy stuff, largely, not all, but
I mean, don't you buy ice cream when you're feeling nihilistic? I mean, it works, doesn't it? So I'm sorry, but no, I think, and then I'll pass it to Mr. Wynn and Jason. Good to see you, sir. I think on this idea, like kids, yeah, they see a ladybug or a centipede, and it's like, everyone, come outside. There's a freaking centipede, and it's a big freaking deal. So there's one way, again, when people talk about the meaning crisis, there's one way it's like, it's solved. There. There's a way in which it's addressed. The issue is almost keeping it, right? And we talked before about I think it is the real of encountering the other. Once you encounter the other, who then questions your enchantment, or you get anxiety and it opens up that void, and then the symbolic and the real and the imaginary come in, then there's a way in which that enchantment is very difficult to keep. The question is how to move through that and maintain it or to get it back. It's almost like you kind of have a starting enchantment, then you move into the psychoanalytical issues, and then how do you have a, dare I say, child enchantment, adult enchantment in almost a Nietzschean sense, right? That's really hard, and it requires various infrastructures, and you could say you start in an open and closed, and now you need to get to an open and closed, the ability to move between those, right? Well, that's really hard. There's many philosophers and different things who think about this, and perhaps if non-locality is fundamental, that provides a kind of, dare I say, a material basis for thinking that is optimal, because it would be alignment with what is actual, right? Which, if we go back to classical philosophy, the name of the game is to align with actuality, where most people have been like, well, actuality is determinism. So become determined and close, and that's it, right? We cannot help but have our values reflect what we think is real. Like, it's almost inevitable. Like, whatever you think is real, your values will reflect. And so there doesn't seem to be a relationship between what you think fundamental physics is, what theory of physics is, and how you live your life. But at least on a subconscious level, these things do matter. They do kind of trickle down, if you will. And so if you have a world where, exist, maybe I'm not a big fan of the multiverse. If there's many multiverses, well, who cares if we deal with global warming or nihilism or whatever? Yeah, there's many universes. Who cares, right? Like, that sounds ridiculous, but there is a way in which those things can all kind of go together in a manner, right? Like metaphysics, your physics and your reference to it kind of collect. And so I think Stuart Kauffman, because it would also suggest Lee Smolin and time being fundamental, which would get us into many of the things we've talked about, is extremely valuable. It also, to Dimitri's incredible paper recently on the question of freedom in Hegel, it also makes, if at the basis is non-locality and potential is real, then you would expect to have this relationship between determination and freedom, that is consciousness that is freely choosing its determination and aligning with that, and the logic of the movement of the state in the philosophy of right then would make sense, right? Like, you would that doctrine of potential being, because the key to potential being real is that means there is always an interplay between determination and actualization, right? It's never just one or the other. It's never just determinism, nor is it just like think and everything changes in a kind of simplistic way. A way to think about this, and I do think it's very Hegelian. And so I think, so again, whatever you think is reality is going to be your government, your economy, and so on and so forth. If you think that human beings are purely causal creatures, then you fall into a behaviorism that's making a government to stimulate people materialistically to fall into the system you want them to, right? But if instead non-locality is fundamental, potential is fundamental, well, then you actually have to create in your society spaces for people to realize and creatively unfold that potential, and that's how you actualize their fullness, as opposed to simply setting the board of the determinism that is causally always already. But a way to think about it in that Lisbeth experiment, the famous one with the finger moving or whatever, and conscious consciousness is like 1 second behind the one everyone likes that supposedly disproves free will. You're trying to think about what college you're going to go to doesn't work so well. It only works in activity that you've done a million times before and thus integrated into your determination. You know, if you're thinking of more complicated thoughts or complexity, then you cannot have that effect. And all that shows you is that freedom is found in the breaks between your determination, what you think that's going to occur. Well, you have to think about it. It's like the fish kind of that Ebert will talk about in different things, right? Like conscious awareness. Also, too, we should know that if you literally thought everything, you wouldn't be free. Like if you had to constantly think about the ceiling's not falling on me, the ceiling's not falling on me, the desk is here, you can be free precisely because the majority of stuff around you, you don't have to think about. Like if you literally had to consciously think every time you moved your finger, you would not be free, you would be paralyzed, right? So the very fact that your body can operate without you thinking about everything it does is necessary for you to have freedom, right? And so that's likewise Hegel. There has to be determinations precisely so that you can have freedom. Otherwise, you would be crushed. The issue is that creativity, and good to see you, Mr. Rivera, that consciousness of creativity comes into effect regarding things that you are not habituated into and breaks, where the doorknob's not there. Now, the freedom emerges when the doorknob breaks, not when it works, right? When you encounter like difference or complexity or otherness, then the freedom comes in and you set new patterns. And the point of free will in this sense is precisely to change your determinations. Like what is a good athlete working so hard to do? To be able to work without thinking about it. A good goalie can block balls without consciously thinking about it. But that is a result of a really freaking long time of consciously thinking about blocking balls, right? Like the supreme accomplishment of free choice is getting to the place where you can do something without thinking about it, right? And that sort of like work of making, so likewise, the supreme accomplishment of something like non-locality in physics is precisely to arise to cases that can then operate as if potential wasn't real. Like actualization has its own logic that's unfolding, but that's actually possible precisely because non-locality and potentiality is real. Likewise, the very fact that you're able to move your thumb without thinking about it is precisely a testament that you have the freedom to train yourself into various activities. It's not declining the existence of freedom. It's a testament that you use your freedom and you have freedom to shape. And if you couldn't shape your freedom, you wouldn't be free. Freedom to be free must be shapeable. And it must be something that works without you thinking about it. Otherwise, you'd never be free of freedom. If you had to always think about freedom to use it, you would be miserable. So there has to be this relationship between creativity and determination that follows into Hegel's politics and economics and all of that. And if you thought about it, you would reconfigure how you have society. And I think it's what we would expect if non-locality is fundamental, as Mr. Stuart Kauffman is putting forth. But let me give it to Mr. Wynn and Ms. Willem. Mr. Wynn.
It's good timing that Javier joined, actually, because my comment was going to refer back to him, what he said, I think it was last week, about you can say like the fear and trembling of kind of losing your narrative. And I think this is kind of, Javier felt it. Yeah, I think this is what it comes down to, again, like to just bridge what was said before with Philip and everything. Like, and what you said, Daniel, like the reality that you see becomes the reality that is. And that's what the question of being is for Heidegger. And I think what Philip said about Heidegger's reference to technology, the fact that technology makes us experience life or reality or being or whatever as dark, that's our kind of condition today. Like in the forgetfulness of being, we look out and we see an openness, but it induces anxiety because we don't see a thing, you know? Like science has taught us to not be enchanted with those prior qualities or types of enchantment that we were used to in the past, like perhaps a kind of dogmatic idea of God as like the other out there, you know? Like modern science makes us question the ability to think the other out there. Kant made us question the ability to think the other out there and barred it, you know? It says, no, like that's the noumenal. Let's focus on the subject, you know? And I think this is kind of how we find ourselves. And I think this is this specific point today is like, what is your philosophy in a sense? Like, how do you experience being? How do you experience life? And I think that's what it comes. I think that really always is what it boils down to in terms of how you experience the openness. And I think Heidegger's beauty, Hegel's beauty, and good philosophy, in my opinion, it kind of is re-enchanting the openness in a way, or it's at least having a kind of faith that it's not just us, it's not just ourselves in our subjective positions placing onto things narratives, that actually there are things that come forth outside of ourselves, you know? Like, this is why I think Heidegger likes to think that he can think beyond the subject-object relationship. Like, he likes the idea that there are disclosures of things, that things are gathered to your mind, you know? Like, he would even say, like, even in absence, like, even, for example, in things that have now gone in the past or things that are not yet here, there's more truth in that than sometimes something that's directly in front of you. Because he thinks that what is a region, so he uses the word regioning a lot, is nothing to do with objects near you. It's to do with your relationship to those objects in the sense that they're gathered to mind. You know, like you can look at a bridge and you have the history of that bridge, which is your bridge, in the sense that you grew up in the village next to that bridge. You have memories on that bridge. You know the other side, or you don't know the other side of that bridge. For Heidegger, the way that you relate to that historical particularity is the place of truth. It's the way you relate to life. It's the way in which life is open to you. And again, this is Heidegger's point, I think, and it's his optimism that language, the truth or essence or way of language, is one that finds its truth in simply the fact that it's opened to mystery. It's opened to potentiality. It's opened to change. It's opened to different historical epochs. It's opened to the narrative of the other person. And I think if you try to find truth in a specific object itself, in itself, I think it will always seem dark, you know? But I think because of technology, that's how we have learned to relate to things. We look at someone and say, I want to know you. I want to know who you are. And when my identity that I've given you or placed onto you fails, there seems to be that breakdown. And I think that's the anxiety of all of this, is like we face constantly like objects that seem to just destroy themselves, or we destroy them, or the other destroys themselves, you know? And again, I think it's always about the optimism of what that destruction means, and where that can bring you. And I really do think there is something really beautiful about the experience of having something destroyed, because I think that is the place of potentiality, and it's a place of even questioning the very way within you the way within which you understood things or people. I think that's the biggest lesson I've had in my life, is like, oh, maybe I've encountered failures only because I've experienced or I've seen something in a specific way, you know, like death. Of course, death is the most traumatizing thing in the world because there's no sense to it. But then I think that is the place in which you learn that you can't change, or you can't place, or you can't repeat it because it's impossible. But maybe you can be open towards that experience, open to the fact that it's literally inevitable in that sense. And again, that's the thing, it's about how you are with it in some way. And I did want to read a little quote from Country Path Conversations, which basically says, to go back to what, then I guess it started with Sam, I think, like, this is my note, the horizon from before, the horizon of each epoch or way or historical moment of understanding thus brings forth something else besides a horizon. This is Heidegger's point. Within each horizon, something comes forth which is besides this horizon. In his early work, he called it the silence, the clearing. But then, because I searched for the word enchanted, so then he calls it the openness. And he says, but for Heidegger, it is, quote, something like a region. So he uses the word region. And it's quite interesting. This quote has the word region and enchantment. It says, quote, something like a region, an enchanted region where everything belonging there returns to that in which it rests. So he sees how each being in itself is resting. It's at home in a way, because being's giving it. And the problem with human beings is we think that we have to give meaning. We think that we have to posit and place onto things meaning. In a way, there is no meaning, but you can experience things in a way where there's a rest, a phenomenological rest, like an experience, you know? So Heidegger talks about Hegel's concept of experience, to say that Hegel, in the way, exactly the same way that Daniel said it, can experience rest in the change. You know, like you can experience like a peace within the turmoil of history and the constant inevitable possibilities that no one has, even God doesn't know, you know. There's a kind of rest in that experience, or a faith, or a grace, or something like this. And I think this is where truth comes back in the equation for me. And it goes to, because basically Javier last week asked the question, like, what happens when someone does encounter the anxiety of the fact that narratives kind of disappear each time? And it's like, yeah, it's true. Like it makes you feel anxious as fuck. Like it's horrible, you know. But yeah.
No, magnificent. I'll pass it to Sam here. Well, there's a few things. So on that idea of kind of this movement of consciousness, this kind of different of experience and different things. Also, I like what you were saying about rest. It makes me think about the faithful presence. There is a good story requires a certain resting, because if you pour in from the top an inciting incident, it's not really resting. What you want to do is have the character be resting, and then something arises in the logic of what they are encountering that sends them out. There is a certain irony that they are forced to confront, or a certain point where their highest values, like justice, where they try to extend this value that has always guided them to this point, and they find a point where justice, doing what they thought was just, actually creates an injustice. So it's more of a saturation point in a kind of Ebert sense. Many good stories are actually not so much an inciting incident from the outside, but where a character follows their own logic and values that have worked all their life up to a certain point that then turns into their opposite. And it turns out, and then that's irony. X does Y for Z, and Y is precisely why X doesn't get Z. And then the story emerges out of a changing of seeing. You then see the world as a place where values and good intention can lead you there. And what will you do now? You know, will you take responsibility for what you did on it on purpose? Will you change? There's so many. Once you see something you can't unsee, you have to respond. And that's what a lot of great stories will do. But that's actually a rest. That's where rest is not inactive per se. Rest is the awaiting of the changing of eyes, to which then you will respond, because it will be the world calling you versus you imposing upon the world. And therefore you are actually operating in a manner that collapses and deconstructs the subject-object divide, because you were responding to the object that called external to you that you will now respond to. So there's not a hard divide between the subject and object. In fact, you need the external world to call you. Otherwise, the only story you can have is one that you pour on from the top, and that tends to be a bad story. And so there is something about rest. Like, you know, the obvious example is something like The Lord of the Rings, or many of these classical stories where they just want to be at home, man. And then something calls them. Something comes for them, right? And I think that's quite important. And actually, if at the basis of reality is A-B logic, Hegel, contradiction, non-locality, or different things, then reality actually entails in itself something that can come forth to break through, to unveil incompleteness, to unveil that what you thought was A is B, to unveil that potentiality is real. But you have to rest in the knowledge of that to be in the position for that to occur and to come forth to you, to which then you can respond. And then you would have reason to think that what you're responding to is not a process of your ego and simply self-ingrantation or just following desire to your own desired end. It would actually be a reason to think that it is responding to something greater than you, per se, or something outside of you, which maybe it's a trick. Maybe it's a Lovecraft creature that's luring you forth, right? But that's exactly why courage is needed, and there's risk to all of this, I think. But let me pass it to Miss Sam Willem. Miss Willem.
Thank you. This is really wonderful conversation. Yeah, I really think like this has nothing to do with mimetic rivalry, right? Like this is a very immediate experience of reverence that you have when you're encountered with these kinds of seeing. And sometimes I'm sort of overwhelmed by the way in which visual metaphors like just dominate my thinking and my movement. I don't know, like that doesn't really make sense, but you know, we started this conversation with this idea that you put little theories on in front of your eyes and you look out at the world through them, and then we've moved to this topic here, and I'm thinking also about what Phillip had said about like how, you know, you do drugs and then you just see the world differently, and like I mean, love drugs, like but I do think that like one of the hardest drugs I've ever done is like poetry, like it's just like writing poetry, reading poetry, you know, like it really, for me, it's made enchantment stay with me. And I think really superb poets, they paint the change of seeing, the changing seeing, sort of like you have all these layers of translucent imagery around you, and you just see them all collapse and align onto one another. And that's for me a really great poem and a great poet. And I think it's really related to language, because I think language can do that for me, you know, as poetic language or any just language, because, you know, if I say this is a cup, but it's also a vessel, you know, so those are two layers that collapse and align in the object, and then you've got, you know, it's also glass, it's the material glass, you know, it becomes all of these ways of knowing that become ways of intervening, that become whole chains of narratives, you know, like glass, it's actually sand, but it's been processed in this way and it's made of these molecules. Cups, they're used in these cultures in these ways, and those cultures in other ways, and then you've got this other chain that says it's a vessel, and a vessel is also a ship, you know, like you know, so it's just like the world in like one little thing that I can hold in my hand. It just becomes like a whole world unto itself. And that is kind of like what poetry can give us. And it reminds me of this one quote that is probably my most thought with quote, which is by Rabindranath Tagore from Creative Unity. And he's just saying, like, infinity, it's not a magnitude, it's not an extensive thing. Infinity doesn't need to go outward, onward forever, because infinity is like the mystery of union, and that union is the alignments. And sometimes in architecture, I'm so like curious about like why alignments are so pleasing, you know, when you get the little parapet to line up with other parapet and it aligns, and you know, you get everything aligned and coherent with one another, connected. It creates pleasing spaces, and why is symmetry pleasing? I think it's because it shows us these principles in operation, just illustrated as things. What do I got?
No, that's a beautiful question. I'll pass to Mr. Rivera and Tyler. Well, there's funny because there is something about that moment of symmetry where it's almost invitational. Like it's saying you can participate in the world in a manner that intelligibly and meaningfully increases possibility. It's like climbing one of those rock walls and you put your foot somewhere and this is a good hold. I can just tell. Which then, what's interesting is, what's also kind of mysterious is that sense of pleasing is reliable, is fairly reliable, right? Like, it's like, it actually is good that you have symmetry, or you actually have done something meaningful. And this is where you get that mysterious intuition that Bergson talks about, right? Like this sort of intuition that symmetry is good. But then there's also a way, which we know flatness can be bad, or symmetry that doesn't have room for the creative change, right? And so then you have this needing to mediate the concept, because if you just stick in the intuition, you get what Hegel's warning about in the Phenomenology of Spirit, where people don't mediate the concept and you get all this trouble. But then you also have this autonomous rationality. Let's just make everything symmetrical. And then it's dead because it's flat, right? But it's very interesting where, well, if we take this model of free will needing determination, it's almost like symmetry. You go, now my freedom can operate. Like the symmetry, it's the symmetry as the invitation to create or to be free now. It's not the symmetry for its own sake to make everything symmetrical and not creative, but in fact that it's now the invitation to dialectically participate in this manner of freedom with determination. And I should also know, I meant to say this, the other key with the Libet experiment, and the guy out of Sweden said this, Tora, you know, what he was saying is that the Libet experiment would only disprove free will if you are your conscious experience. But if you also are your body and your conscious experience is only one dimension of you, then that doesn't necessarily disprove freedom at all, right? Like we over-identify with the awareness. But again, look at the athlete. Would we say that the athlete isn't their capacity to automatically block the ball without thinking of it? Would we say the dancer isn't their automatic capacity to dance without overly thinking about it? No, we would say that's exactly what makes them an athlete. That's exactly what makes them a dancer. That's exactly the freaking point of practice, is to get to that point where you can do things without thinking about it. We wouldn't say, that proves that the goalie doesn't have free will. That would be very odd. No, it's like, no, that's exactly that is you. That ability to make yourself able to do things without thinking about it is a crowning achievement of thinking. Like, you work for years at, like, why does it take, the Gladwell 10,000, why does it take 10,000 hours? Probably more like 30,000, but whatever it is, why does it take so long to get good at something? Because it's really hard to be able to do something without thinking about it. It takes a whole lot of freaking thinking to get to the place where you don't have to think about it. The reason you can move your thumb without thinking about it is because you move your thumbs thousands upon thousands of times. And so you get to the place. Like, the other thing, Elizabeth, children can't move their thumbs without thinking about it. They can't even stand up without thinking about it. They have to think about it, right? It's after standing up and walking for thousands of times that then you can do it without thinking about it. And that's what athletes do. That's what painters do. This does not disprove free will. In fact, it proves that free will can actually influence and change the determinations of material reality. It can actually shape the direction of cause and effect, not be at the mercy of cause and effect. So it's very important to get that correct. And I really appreciate everything, but let me give it to Javier Rivera. That reading of that experiment is disproving free will, which is very common. And I was writing out of the Spolowski book again, which was a mistake. But let me give it to Mr. Rivera. Mr. Rivera.
Okay. So yeah, I mean, I've been playing with this idea. I mean, of course, I don't even know. I mean, I don't think it's true, but I think there's something there. I think there's something there didactically that we can gather for it. So what I've been thinking about is this idea of, and Wynn kind of reminded me of this idea, is maximizing vulnerability in our lives. And so the way I look at it is, to maximize vulnerability it wouldn't be to pinpoint a universal vulnerability for everyone. It would be to pinpoint a sort of relative vulnerability, which is to say something like, if what would make us more vulnerable is to say that we have no freedom, I would entertain that, because it would allow me to come to grips with something about myself. But if I was comforted by the fact that we have no freedom, and suddenly I found myself vulnerable that I do have freedom, and that there is choices that could be made for myself, you see, it becomes a different relation completely. Maximizing this idea of vulnerability, because it would just be fundamentally relative. Lately, I've been reading a lot of like Badu, and being an event, and what's put me in a state maybe of like vulnerability is like thinking mathematics is ontology, right? Where I was originally so fascinated with poetic language, experience as such, but just to even entertain that mathematics can point to a more fundamental ontology through displaying multiple forms of multiplicity itself, how it can think multiplicity itself. I mean, I don't know, right? But like, I'm entertaining it. I'm entertaining. I don't know if Badu is right, but it's interesting. It's interesting. It makes me vulnerable, because it would say then that the one is not. There is no one. There is just the void and infinite multiplicity. But I think my main point is less about Badu and more about the fact that maximizing vulnerability shows something didactically, but I can't even say what that would be unless you do it. And you could say this is why I'm already entertaining the idea, because like even the idea of like entertaining Nietzsche's innocence of becoming. That's really frightening, because that means there's no one to blame. There's no one to convict as such. It means that we convict solely because the world operates as such and must convict. That's how we've always operated. But in the end, everyone's innocent because of becoming. That's something frightening to even like entertain, right? But it allows you to come to grips with something. You know, what that is sort of open. And it is frightening in a way. For it could be frightening to some of us, maybe not for others. But just this idea of maximizing vulnerability, I thought was interesting, because it could be a tool maybe to live your life in the sense of pinpointing your vulnerability and already facing it, you know, facing it with the idea of maybe my narrative is wrong. I wouldn't know, but I'm already acting as if it was wrong, and what that does to the human being. To already acting ahead of it. Yeah. I guess that's it.
No, thank you, Mr. Rivera, and I'll pass it to Todd. Well, there's a funny way in which perhaps the sublation, to use, you know, we have to get our Hegel quota of using Hegel terms just enough times, whereas the sublation of open and closedness might be vulnerability, because there's a way in which, you know, you are in something, but you're open and you're not defending yourself. So there might be something there. I think also, if I go to the Ivan Illich distinction, I like, you know, the difference between plan and prepare. Like, planning is where you know what the future is, you know what you're going to do. Prepared is where you're prepared for whatever the future throws at you. But of course, there's a vulnerability in preparation, because of course, what you're doing to be ready for what you can't predict may not be that, and may overwhelm you, right? So then there's a temptation to plan to make sure bad things don't occur, as opposed to instead being ready for any bad things or unexpected thing that occurs, right? That kind of Ivan Illich distinction. And of course, if we're planning too much, then we're too fixed in a narrative. And when that occurs, we tend to keep out otherness and all of these other problems that occur. So there is something to be said about maximizing vulnerability. And I think about that in the sense of, like, with Ivan Illich, or even you could say with that kind of Nietzsche childhood, where what you're doing is you're not avoiding encounter. You're preparing for encounter. So it's not where you're just letting yourself be destroyed, but you're also not letting yourself be removed from the place of the encounter. Which then, if we go back to non-locality and groundlessness appears at the other, which is in the encounter, which is the hitting of limit in the Ebert sense, which, if there is something connecting between groundlessness and non-locality, at least metaphorically, that is the place where potential is real. And basically only there is where potential is real. And if in that place where potential is real, then there is the actuality of the possibility of different narrative, or seeing enchantment, or having different breakthroughs. But it seems to be in that encounter, a real encounter. And again, there seems to be a history in storytelling where real encounter and real transformation and real potential go together, which of course would make sense if potential is real. Also, I should note another nice thing about Mr. Stuart Kauffman's theory is, if you say potential or real, you can get some benefits of multiverse thinking, as I understand it, without saying those multiverses are actual. Because, you know, that's the problem right now. Like, you have the supersymmetry that gives you 10 billion like multiverses or different things that all seem to exist at the same time. Well, if you just say potential is real, but not all potential is actualized, then you can deal with some of that mathematics without necessarily going down the rabbit hole of where string theory seems like it's in a lot of trouble but doesn't know how to get out of it. So that was something I just wanted to note. But let me pass it to Tyler and then Mr. Wynn.
Earlier, Daniel, when you were talking about these different particles, 300 million miles apart from each other, one moving and affecting the position of another 300 million miles apart, I remembered this little passage from a story from probably 3 years ago that I read, that maybe some of you guys are familiar with. And I wasn't thinking that I was like, I don't know if I'll share this. But then when Sam said poetry is the hardest drug I've ever done, I mean, I was like, well, shoot, let's go for it. I think I want that on a t-shirt. And there's something about this quote that, I don't know, has this idea also of poetry keeping the world enchanted. I don't really know, though, how this all fits in, but I guess with everything else, but I just wanted to share it. So it comes from Anton Chekhov's short story, The Student. And it's a very, very quick read. If you've got 5 minutes, you can pretty much read it. And it's about this young student who visits, or I can't remember exactly how it goes, but he ends up telling the story of Peter betraying Jesus, and he's telling it to these two women who are standing outside by a fire, and the student is affected by how much his retelling of the story of Peter affects these women. And he says, or the story says, and joy suddenly stirred in his soul, and he even stopped for a minute to take a breath. The past, he thought, is linked with the present by an unbroken chain of events flowing one out of another. And it seemed to him that he had just seen both ends of that chain, that when he touched the one end, the other quivered. So anyways, I don't know exactly how that all fits in, but I just wanted to share that with you guys. Thanks.
Well, that was beautiful, and I'm always down for a Chekhov reference. Very nice. The Russians are great. I will pass it to Mr. Wynn. Well, there is a sense. Look, if we look at the Bergson, there is definitely a sense, and even the Hegelian notion that the way you go into the future well is to interpret the past, which then changes what you are today. That changes how you unfold. Like, that's one of the great secrets. Is the best way to go into the future is to do the work of interpreting the past, and the reason why, I think, speaks to something very important that Sam was getting at, the different layers of the glass, right? Makes me think of the great Wallace Stevens 13 Ways of a Blackbird, looking at a blackbird, right? And there's this idea that you got Ian McGilchrist saying that the key is realizing that the cup, you can think about chemistry, physics, poetry, all of those are equally real, right? Like every one of those layers. There's a real sense in which the story begins when you realize that multiple layers are equally real, but you can't think them all at once. You have to develop the ability to know when to move between the frameworks, the symbolic, to go back to Alfred Korzybski and Sanity and Science and Sanity. And basically what Alfred is telling you back in, I guess, 1933 is when this book comes out. He's like, if you cannot move between symbolics, if you cannot move between different dimensions, you will go crazy and your life will suck. That's what he's telling you. So we exist in, so basically what he's saying, it's a matter of sanity to realize that there are 13 ways of looking at a blackbird, that dimensions have different layers to them. If you cannot do that, you'll be stuck in a symbolic. When you encounter an anomaly that the symbolic cannot account for, you'll have to deny it, which will lead to a disavowal. And actually it leads to all these. It's in a very funny way, Alfred Korzybski sets up psychoanalysis with Lacan and all of these different people. Like he's kind of setting the stage in a theory of semantics. And I know Lacan has a history with that, but there really is this idea that if you're stuck in a symbolic, but you don't even know you're stuck in a symbolic, when you encounter the real, that cannot by definition account for the symbolic, you either have to change, open up to it, or you get all sorts of trouble. The key to the ability to move between symbolics is realizing that different symbolics are equally real, like an Ian McGilchrist are telling you, or Wallace Stevens, right? So the trick for Hegel is one of the reasons why you move into the future well by interpreting the past is because you realize, wait, there are multiple layers to things in the past. The only way to learn that lesson tends to be through interpretive acts. Like almost by definition, interpretation has to be the way that you learn that there are multiple dimensions to things, right? That the way they just present themselves to you is not the only way that they are, that there are other dimensions that require the act of thinking and interpretation to realize, and those are all equally real. So anything that trains you in the act of interpretation, trains you in the act of attention, I think is what, Simone Weil, Ivan Illich, but awareness. For Simone Weil, if you don't, this ability of attention or awareness, people call it different things, that Milligras is getting, if you cannot do that, what Simone Weil told you is you'd be stuck in affliction, which is basically AA logic. You're stuck in a self-consistent system that you can never escape. How do you get away from that? Well, a lot of people said nihilism. Okay. What if instead we actually could move between dimensions, right? Like different ways of awareness and seeing things, right? Different ways of seeing. Well, that's when the story begins. That's when the unfolding can occur. That's what Hegel is saying history can teach you. It's also what poetry can teach you. It's also what religion can teach you. Like these all have these interpretive practices which are training you in the capacity to see things according to different symbolics, which if you cannot do, mental illness for Korzybski is basically inevitable. Also totalitarianism, self-effacement, and all of these different things. But this is why I really like what Stuart Kauffman is saying. If you don't have a physics theory, though, that makes potential real, then all of this seems like wishy-washy, wishful thinking. Oh, it sure would be nice if different dimensions of a blackbird were equally real. It sure would be nice if we could escape affliction. But yeah, that's just poetic. You know, it sure would be nice if interpretation could teach you how to move between things. But the physics say that we're in a deterministic world of AA and that potentials are not real. And if, yeah, sure, there are multiverses, but not for you because you're in this one, so you can't access those. So potential's not real for you. So what is the reason why this Stuart Kauffman of making non-locality fundamental is very interesting is because then all of this seems like it's not just wishful thinking. It actually would seem to be grounded in a truth, and truth organizes values, right? And then Hegel would seem to make sense. And then the potential being real. And then this theory of moving into the future by interpreting the past seems to make sense. And so this cultivation of the capacity of interpretation to see different dimensions of things that are equally real, which if you cannot do, you're basically doomed for affliction, you're doomed for mental illness. This is actually participating rightly in a universe that is fundamentally non-local where potential is real. That's why it works, because you're actually participating in how the universe actually is in doing that. But let me pass it to Mr. Thomas Wynn and then Jason. And then I have about 20 minutes, and I suppose I said weedy, but let me give it to Mr. Wynn. Mr. Wynn.
I'll be very quick. It's just to go to kind of what Tyler was saying, like introducing just the simple fact of poetry itself, I think is speaking to the quality of existence, which I think comes about from having this theory of the non-regions, you know, like having this theory which allows for the spontaneity of life, but that thing which kind of seems to be beyond horizons. And I think, again, this is just my quick point. It always comes down to what you think occurs in this kind of space where things are destroyed. And there's a quote kind of towards the end of Conversation on the Country Pub about thinking. I think it's the end paragraph, actually, where it talks about the fact that when you wait, so waiting is a key theme in this, you're released to the indeterminate, which is the passageway of anxiety, is the passageway of madness. Like we said last time on the net, like losing the plot in English, like British English, it means like you're losing your standing, like you're being degrounded upon the plot that you placed yourself, you know, or the plot of the narrative. But Heidegger's point is that when you become waitful and even more void, you become emptier in some way, but then richer in contingencies, meaning you become richer in your historical narratives, you become richer in those ways of understanding the world around you. So then the scientist says, then please tell me also, in your curious emptiness, in what respect is releasement, because this is also the other concept, which is like a way of being, can be akin to what is noble. And then the scholar says, noble is what has origins, meaning truth or something prior to the narrative. And the teacher says, not only that, but what is noble is abiding in the origin of its nature. So this is the task of thinking, of being as human beings, is to release, like, is to just let things happen, like be passive for a moment and realize that you don't need to be passive, because the I that you thought you were to be passive is also a narrative in some way. And I think this is just really the key, is like, and I think this is, again, is what people are starting to become interested in, even in spirituality, is like themes of Taoism, Zen Buddhism, some aspects of Christianity, which is like releasing, like kenosis. It's like, you know, like letting it, whatever it is for you, take you over in some sense. And this is the leap. And this is like again, it comes up all the time. Adam Watts, like the wisdom of insecurity. There's something here which is like that move. And I think this is always really fundamental, because you're released to it in that sense. And I think that's the point. What is it for you? For Heidegger, being is just that which lets you be released to it. And for Hegel, and this is the point for Hegel in my reading, like the absolute wills your attention. And all that experience means is that you come along to the fact that you are present before the truth of your own presence in some sense. And the quality of that is opened and released. And then everything else happens, you know, then it's contingent, then it's rich contingency. And I think this is what Tyler's point, like the poetry actually is that place or language which is able to think that. Like poetry is able to think that speculative side of life, which for a rationalist or an empiricist, they would deny this, you know? Or for a scientist who only wants what is and like fixed representative thinking, which says like, no, this object is this object, or this object has a relationship to that object, that takes away potentiality. Or it only allows for a certain specific form of potentiality. But then, of course, there's always excess. There's always something which creeps in. And I think, again, good philosophy is just waiting to be surprised, I think. And it hangs out there, like the net sessions are just hanging out in that space, basically. That's how I view this experience, is like we're all kind of waiting for someone to say something and then someone else triggered, you know. And this is why this is nice.
Oh, absolutely. We should, like, Conversations in a Country Pub. Like, is there a better philosophical book title? I mean, you know, and yeah, that's surprise. Well, the surprise that's critical, because if we go to Dimitri's paper on this idea of philosophy is not about, say, overturning the tradition or overturning the state. These are the determinations that are given to you. Thus, you assume they're there for a reason. Philosophy is waiting for the point where it turns out protection, national defense, and individual freedom come in conflict. And that's what you're looking for, the conflicts, the contradictions to think, right? Because, yeah, there's a point where you have to choose between privacy and protection, right? Okay, you have to, okay, turns out, following Earl Thompson, that wages and profit don't necessarily go together. Let's think that, like, wages don't necessarily go up when profit goes up. Okay, that's what you think, not the tear down all of the economic system around. The points of the contradiction, which then is to your point, must be a point of surprise. Because otherwise they wouldn't be there, right? Like, that's why they're like, people didn't know that was going to happen. So you're waiting for the encounter with the surprise. For the thing, you're hanging out in the government, you're hanging out in a country the way that it is, and then the freedom arises precisely in the question of how you respond to the surprise, how you respond to the determinations and what you do, right? How you think about it. That's where it occurs. But we don't tend to associate with that with freedom because it's scary. It makes you anxious. It's difficult. I don't want to think about these trade-offs. I don't want to think, let's just tear it all down, right? Tearing with the negativity, to use that phrase, that's where the freedom is, but it doesn't feel like freedom. You were taught your entire life freedom is when you get to go to the King's Dominion Park and choose between the frickin' roller coasters. And this doesn't feel like that. This feels bad. No, this is it. But in that very negativity, if you can sit with it, that groundlessness, that's opening up to the creative potential, the freedom, the non-locality, and all of these different things. And then it's also opening up to the possibility of seeing things differently that in their potentiality are potentially real based on the choices that you make. And so I really like that. But let me give it to Jason and Phillip Shinn. Jason, it is good to see you, sir. I hope you are doing well.
Good to see you too. I hope you're doing well. I love that bit about being surprised. You know, I feel like as I enter more and more into the philosophical world, I feel like philosophers are always, I guess in literature there is the term in medias res. You know, you're always finding yourself at the concluding moment and at the opening moment. You know, like it's always, things are always like that. So surprise is absolutely crucial. I do feel also that, you know, having been more immersed in philosophy, that things are kind of, I guess to use an example you use, you know, the gap between the goalkeeper and the act of goalkeeping, they're just becoming wide. And I feel like this is for everything in life, you know, like in a sense, you know, I can't lift my hand without it being perplexing. I do feel like that's just that's, you know, it's of course I'm kind of, it's perplexing because it confronts us in the form of a problem. But perhaps maybe this, you know, this is the most utmost concrete way that things are, you know. More and more, the more I think about this, is that, you know, I mean, we have art, we have religion. These are ways to encounter the absolute. But philosophy remains, I think, you know, in other words, what I'm saying is that if you haven't thought the thing philosophically, I don't think you've thought the thing at all, in a sense, you know, in a very in a very basic phenomenological sense, you know, in the most actual way. You know, an example would be the problem of abortion, for example, right? I don't think if you take it as a physicalist, you have not dealt with the problem. If you think about it as a in terms of religion, in terms of like, oh, is there, you know, a soul and so on, you haven't encountered the problem. I think you've only dealt with the thing if it's in this perplexing form, right? Because I do think that ultimately it is what it is a philosophical problem. Which, you know, I don't know how this connects, but the thing that I talked about things being more separated, you know, the cause being separated from the effect and so on. I think this is a part of a larger trend of to return to the topic of disenchantment. I feel like, you know, recently, I know there's limited time. I'll be quick with this, but recently we visited a water park, and you know, I guess I'm in my 30s now. It doesn't do it anymore. But it's just, I experienced a kind of like what could be described as subjective destitution. You know, like it's like these people are just lining up, going down. You know, there's such an absurdity to the situation. You know, but so it's interesting to me that I can at once be like, okay, this doesn't work anymore. Something, you know, I can't fucking enjoy this thing. Sorry. But I can't feel the same way anymore. But at the same time, wow, look at the absurdity, you know, like this, it's very this human animal. So I feel almost that, you know, the enchantment part, you know, I mean this is a question. Do we know that we are enchanted? How do we know, right? Because it is a form of forgetting. And I, you know, when I'm talking, when I was listening to you guys earlier, I was just, my mind went all over the place. How can I engage with this? You know, how come I don't have anything to say about this? You know, it's a kind of problem. But then my family made a noise. You know, they're presencing themselves like, oh God, now I can't speak because my family's there. I feel embarrassed. You know? But then I realized, oh, I was enchanted. That was that I was in it. I was in the thick of it. You know, I didn't even know. You know, and then obviously we can think about negative freedom in this sense, right? When a person is addicted, or when a person is like, I'm thinking here of a gambler. He's continually frustrated, right? He's not in it. He's not the, how come I can't enjoy myself? You know, right? I can't get to the thing. But then shit blows over. He's out in the streets like, oh God, that was so much fun, you know. So I wonder if enchantment, I wonder if it's the disenchantment. It is an open question. Is the actual moment, and whereas the enchantment is the possible, you know. So I'll end it right there, I guess. But you know, these are some of the perplexities.
Delightful. No, that's fantastic. First off, that coffee holder you have behind you on the shelf, I have the exact same one, and it's the best. It keeps it warm.
Yes.
That little silver one, like it never
Yes.
gets cold. It's so great.
Yeah,
I wish
it's
I
awesome.
could.
Yeah.
I wish I could find more.
Yeah.
What you were saying on the I think what's very interesting is there's the move of realizing there are multiple ways of looking at a blackbird, which then can be, oh, well, then it's all arbitrary. So there's a kind of disenchantment. Before, when you're like, wow, look at that blackbird, it's such a pretty bird, right? But then when you open up the possibility, the first feeling of that can be, well, then nothing matters, right? The tricky thing is figuring out how to actually go, no, they're all real, and I choose this one, to kind of forget yourself in it. There is some sort of capacity there that I do think is training a certain skill. Like this is like going through, you have to kind of go through the disenchantment of philosophy to actually get to the place of the self-forgetfulness of philosophy, right? And that's like, that's, you know, that we've talked about David Hume, that like, that's all these kind of tricks, right? Like, I think a way to put it also too, I think a lot of culture wars are a result of a lack of perplexement. Like, you know, we need cultural perplexement, which then turns into wonder as opposed to this kind of collapse, right? I think it ties to the question as well, to this idea of when we're talking about theory or map, and Kuhn was brought up. So, you know, the whole idea of a paradigm shift for Kuhn is you have this theory that people are adamantly defending, and then you keep finding anomalies, and eventually the anomaly is saturated and it collapses. You have a new theory, right? You have these kind of anomalies that you work through, right? I think likewise, the point of a map or a theory is actually, the point of a map is actually to find the places that are wrong. Like this is Kuhn's whole point. The point of a scientific theory is to find precisely where they are wrong, because that is actually where the potential comes forth most real. Which then again, if potential is fundamental, then that's the most real point. But guess what? It's the most real point precisely when it seems to be the least real point or the most problematic point, because the map has failed. Like, you know, oh my gosh, the point that seems most problematic is also the potential of something new coming forth, right? So likewise, the point of disenchantment is precisely where a new possibility of enchantment arises, but it's difficult. And there's some sort of working with it, I think. Like you have to, like nihilism, you have to go through nihilism and groundlessness to get to the place of letting be, as Wynne will say, or the good nihilism, right? But that is, I think it is, if there is something about using your thumb a lot that lets you then use it without thinking about it, you become unconscious of it, there may be something too of practices of seeing multiple layers of reality, of the blackbird, of finding the point in the map that's incomplete, of doing that enough where then you're able to do it, and it's something that you don't think about. So the disenchantment actually then falls back into self-forgetfulness, and now you're able to have the enchantment with the disenchantment, the dis in parentheses, if you will. And now you can have enchantment without being susceptible to political capture, totalitarianism, symmetry that then keeps out otherness, because that's the issue. You can avoid disenchantment by simply only hanging out with Christians, or only hanging out with people that think like you, or only ever not growing up. The water park can stay awesome forever if you never grow up, right? But that's Neverland, right? That's Peter Pan or something, right? That doesn't seem correct, although it's a temptation. But then once you realize, oh man, it doesn't enchant me, then it's tempting to fall into hopelessness and nihilism, right? Like likewise, once you hear the Lesbet experiment of the thumb moving before you think about it, you're like, well, no such thing as free will. What's the point, right? There's a certain kind of hopelessness that comes with it. It's like, no, this realization of the break is precisely then around which one can practice until they put in their 10,000 hours, and then encountering the things of the multiple layers and disenchantment and growing up actually then are the determinations in which creativity is possible and new possibilities and new growing up. But you have to go through perhaps the practices of philosophical encounter. And when you know what you're saying on philosophy, there is something about poetry and literature. It's very interesting. Obviously, we know Hegel talks about philosophy, religion, and art as being really important. What do all three of those seem to do? All three of those seem to be the realization that there are multiple layers in operation, that there are different ways of seeing something, and all of them seem to be equally real, right? And you get used to that. You get familiarized with it. Eventually, it becomes like your thumb moving without you thinking about it. Likewise, the conditions of disenchantment then fall into it. The problem is when the conditions of disenchantment are things you're conscious of, because then you're consciously disenchanted. And that leads to all of the problems, right? But that means you have to habituate yourself to the conditions of disenchantment, which then actually make them fall into self-forgetfulness, and you become skilled in the multi-layers. And when you encounter the water park, it's like you can be enchanted by the fact you're not enchanted. Wow, I used to be enchanted by this. Why am I not anymore? What does that mean about me? What is it about? Okay, well, maybe I shouldn't look at the water park. Wow, people are interesting, right? Maybe I shouldn't do this anymore. Maybe I should instead take walks in the wood. Like there's ways of encountering, which instead of interpreting it as evidence that life sucks, you say, I should change my strategy, per se. I should try to approach something else that will surprise me. Or maybe I'm not supposed to go to water parks anymore, right? Might save you a lot of money because water parks are expensive, right? Like there's a benefit to realizing, I know, right? There's a benefit. Like there's a, you know, you could say I'm disenchanted with restaurants.
Like every time I go to a restaurant, I'm like, the food's not that good. Michelle's a way better cook. The tips are really expensive. Oh my gosh, it's way too much prices. I am disenchanted with restaurants. Going to restaurants kind of is a painful experience for me, except like 3, right? That's a great thing, because then you're not spending so much money or getting upset because you haven't gone to a restaurant, right? Like, you're not bothered by not going to restaurants because you're disenchanted by them, right? So then you start flipping it into a benefit, right? But then when the day arises where you have to go to a restaurant, you also learn how to be open with that encounter, open to that possibility and different things, right? So again, I don't hate all restaurants, but restaurants can be very disillusioning for me. But let me give it to Phillip and then Tyler.
I mean, I think this is like one of the, I don't know why Heidegger's still on my mind today, but he has this word Befindlichkeit, which translates to like how one finds oneself. But people also often say it's like mood, which is more like Stimmung in German. And the idea is like almost all our thinking is downstream of that. And this kind of links up with Stein and Gaffney's idea of riding the waves of the naive, the tragic, and the post-tragic. And I think like waiting could play a great role in that. And I also feel like in order to see certain things, they have to be like, what up, Luber? They got to be in like a value sandwich. So like before you see it, you have to like already value it, kind of. And then once you see it, it's like you kind of assign it a value that then you're like, okay, well, should I stick on this value that I'm assigning it? Am I even the person assigning it this value? Is it like some authority? Is it because my phone told me or something? And then I think the move like is to think, like you were saying, Daniel, earlier with the non-locality. Like I'm checking out World is Will and Representation right now, and there's this like little passage in it where Schopenhauer's like, if you want to be a poet, like probably get a day job. No, like definitely get a day job. Like have a day job. And when you get like the flashes, they'll probably come when you're like doing sort of like mundane stuff. And he's like, but if you're a philosopher, don't have a job. Have no job if you're a philosopher and read and write. And so then you see like, oh, to playfully poke fun at a friend, like a theory of time energy might be for philosophers more than poets. And you're like, okay, cool. And how sort of like those theories are with us in this idea of Befindlichkeit, and this idea of where we find ourselves in any given moment. I think it's very interesting.
Yeah, I just love this image of Schopenhauer going into his neighbors, and he's like, "Man, you need a job." Me though, it's cool. It's cool. But I do think it was Rita Dove who said there was something about poetry needing to be slipped in through the moments. Like there was something about the moments that was kind of tied to poetry, and maybe that's because there's something about life being too consistent and symmetrical that hurts the ability to have new language, because you're too locked into a single dimension by which to see things. And having to find a moment in your day job leads to an opening from a closedness that has creative possibility, where perhaps the philosopher is more interested in tracing out the internal consistency of a dimension that you're on, right? If I were to be charitable to that. And I think it is Rita Dove, one of her friends, who talked about that. Mr. Luber, good to see you, sir. But no, I think with the and again, Mr. Luber, I've been going down a rabbit hole while unloading chairs and stuff of Stuart Kauffman on non-locality and quantum theory being fundamental, and I think it would I think it would actually align very well with theme and story in the way described in the book. But let me pass it to, and again, the thing is, if indeed you are looking for this point of things breaking through, like you're looking for where things are not going to be there, you could say that the philosopher is making the map and the poet is ready for where the map fails. And if you don't have both,
you get all sorts of problems, right? When the philosopher's like, oh my gosh, I've encountered the point where it fails, my theory is everything. If you have your poet come and be like, hey, I have a second from my day job. I can help your life not suck. I can have new creative possibility there. So it's interesting to think those. And now my mind goes to the delta effect of Walker Percy with Helen Keller. That is interesting. But let me give it to Tyler here. Tyler, kiss me down by the road. He's in the car, and that's what he's playing with his Uber Beaver. So Tyler, please.
Oh, I'm just thinking on these different ideas of re-enchanting our worlds and thinking of different ways that I find the world to be re-enchanting. And I recently was at a storytelling event where the theme was changes or changed. And I wanted to tell this story about mistakes, which ties into this idea of where the map breaks down. And so I had just been talking with a close friend, and he told me about this mistake that happened as he was communicating with somebody of another language, where he typed in one word and he mistyped it. And then it didn't make sense to the person on the other end who was, getting it in, translated into Spanish. And then my friend had to go back and, sort through what was it that I put in, that he put in. And that, I can't even say what it was because it was so potentially, it's too personal, but potentially has changed his whole symbolic, kind of in this Nonlocality, or has retroactively tinted the way he understands potentially his whole life even. The way that a mistake can really change a symbolic network. I said, I'm going to put on my pants. And she said, oh, I thought you just said, I just shit my pants. Okay, so how does that mistake potentially then change retroactively, or change the symbolic network? Well, it was useful then, from then on, anytime I had to go to the bathroom, I could just say, I'm going to go put on my pants.
Kiss me down by the road. So it was perfect. That's good. Oh my goodness. That's really funny, but that is an example of a symbolic. And notice how a symbolic like that suggests intimacy, right? Like this is something that is also very important. Like for Alfred Korzybski, well, and then I did not know that Wolfgang Smith passed. That's terrible. And I'll pass it to you, Mr. Luber, because he would definitely fall where he's saying, well, we can deal with the observer effect by simply saying all dimensions of reality are equally real, right? The vertical causation. Well, Mr. Stuart Kauffman would be like, yes, potential are real. Like, we just start with non-locality and then the quantum vacuum makes the universe without collapsing into a singular black hole at the beginning. It's very elegant. But the symbolic, like if you cannot create or move, and if you cannot create symbolics, then it will be very difficult to have relationships. And we're actually talking at the beginning about the capacity to move between symbolics in order to make relationships work or to create intimacy. If you are stuck in a symbolic or don't have the ability to, oh, that was funny, let me use that as a kind of language by which to operate, because we are the only two people in the world who will get that language, who will get what that means, right? So a symbolic is created that then transforms what is rational to say or how to converse, that simultaneously changes the conditions of possibility and how you can interact while simultaneously suggesting some sort of relationship, right? That's the powerful of a new symbolic. So just take that and move it up the stack and talk about the universe. If you want a sacred romance with being, it would be useful to create a symbolic of which generates that possibility, and poetry seems to be learning that sort of symbolic. Philosophy is learning that symbolic and just treating the other dimensions of possibility as equally real. If potential is real, that sounds like love is real, because love has a lot to do with potential and difference in relation, right? And so that making that foundational and fundamental opens up possibilities of feeling and loving the world and Thanksgiving and the stuff that Sam was talking about of enchantment. All of those become possible when you own the capacity to create and move and integrate with different kinds of symbolics, because the world is then framed as something more than the world is a place of relationships that are meaningful. But let me pass it to Mr. Luber. Mr. Luber, it is good to see you, sir.
Good to see you too. Good to see everyone. Yeah, I definitely want to bring up Wolfgang here. RIP. I love his work. I think so. From his perspective, non-locality is provable by the instantaneous act of perceiving something. So for him, it's like, okay, well, there's this instantaneous perception, and there seems to almost be an infinite amount of ways in which one can apprehend that instantaneous perception. So because that's the case, he's basically saying that time is before space because you're able to think about the different ways in which you can apprehend that instantaneous perception. So if the space is in a certain sense fixed, then you can think about it, which means you're in time at that moment, which is going through space. It's like 1 foot in space and 1 foot out of space. And you're able to then use language or use some mathematics to apprehend that instantaneous perception. Oh my God, there's different like stages in his thinking. I'm like blanking on the name, but like the ultimate stage, fuck, I forget. But basically, whatever that word is for the ultimate stage is just capturing like the instantaneous. Yes, final boss mode is when it's just the instantaneous perception dimension, basically. And then from that point, time and space emerge, and time for him is primordial because like I was just saying, the ability to understand what we're seeing is in the fact that it's not in some space. And one more thing, like the non-locality, or I call it like non-linear, it's when you are alive, you're just everything is always already, like to use the Heideggerian phrase, but there's this always already aspect because for us to we're like in a certain sense 1 step behind and always 1 step in front of what we're instantly seeing. So in that sense, that's what time is, but like it's all grounded in the fact that it is in some space that's finite that is here right now. So whenever people talk about beyond, there's different stages of beyond. There's the beyond space, which is time, but then the bold move that he makes is there's a beyond time, which is this instantaneous. It's beyond the ability to. It's what grounds time and space together, and therefore is beyond both time and space. And then he has like this theological argument as well. It's definitely like convincing of like there being maybe I'm like slipping on, he uses a bunch of terms, but maybe it's eternity, that there is like this eternal afterlife, basically. I don't really understand the argument to really talk about it too much, but basically because that is the case, there's some eternal afterlife, that's actually what gives rise to this like instantaneous perception that we experience right now. So I'd be curious if anyone could elaborate on that, or if I'm not even explaining it enough to give any elaboration. Perhaps I'm not. Another thing, like a little tangent, but I was just thinking about this. Honestly, like it's basically like I've never seen a space in which philosophers are so vulnerable and so candid with each other, where they can literally critique and talk about each other's character in a philosophical setting. So it's like the idea behind that is I believe in X and Y philosophy. I embody this story or this philosophy, whatever. Okay, let's really look at that. Do you? Do you embody that? Let's talk about it. Let's see where you diverge from the idea state that you think you're operating under. Then on top of that, which I think would be really healthy, I think it would be like honestly the most beautiful conversation, because maybe people might be crying, there might be vulnerabilities that, you know, you don't foresee that would be expressed in that moment, you know, very knee-jerk reaction type of responses, because your character is on the line. Like everyone cares about their character, and to some degree, even oh my God, there's so many comments that I missed out. But basically, the other aspect too is being able forget, let's say you're not sure which philosophy you embody, and you're in question, you know, what you believe in, which I think a lot of philosophers would fall under that category. If that is the case, I do think to find your character, like I think a philosophical dialogos where you're vulnerable and talking about what you really think of the other would be super interesting to me, and it would make people realize what character they are embodying if they weren't sure going into it. So I think that's like an interesting thought in terms of like a sanctuary or space for that to occur in. I don't know if that would be for the internet right now. You know, I personally think that would be some where it's like, we're friends first. And that's why we're having like conversations like this, because we care about each other. But then it's like, we're also philosophers. We think deeply in a more sophisticated way. So who we are has some relation to that. And being philosophers, I think there could be some like carving out to do with that, and like some interesting insights that could be seen. I'm not saying that I necessarily want that. I just thought it was interesting because the type of comments that could be said could be so profound. But I'll pass it off.
No, it's an excellent point. I mean, that's one could say that's church. And that you've never had a successful transfer of confession, community. Bonhoeffer has a book called Living Together Has Never Transitioned into Philosophy, because basically because like a way to look at it, say if Christianity is like, hey, you're a sinner. So if someone tells you you're a sinner, well, you already knew that. And in fact, you need them to tell you because you're self-deceptive. So you are conditioned and prepared for that sort of interaction. But if you are not conditioned and prepared for that kind of interaction, then most people generally say F you, and they walk away and they find self-symmetry in other people, right? So there's this is one of the reasons Belonging Again 2.1 will end with a big emphasis on the question of forgiveness. Because basically, if we don't even know what forgiveness is, and if we can't think forgiveness, none of this is possible because people are too fragile. Also, what you're talking about requires a certain skill of interaction that very, very few people have. And most religions have dealt with it by mediating it through parable or the life of Jesus, right? Like, why is it the pastor at the church may be talking about a parable of Jesus? Because that's a way of indirectly talking to everyone. And then from that, as you emotionally attune people, bring people into it, right? In order to do what you're describing, you would have to have philosophical communities that are skilled in mythos, maybe poetry, maybe literature, the ability to talk about difference. They'd have to believe in different, they'd have to have the meta language skill. They would have to have the ability to move between different symbolics. Also, too, it requires a certain level of incredible self-skepticism, because a lot of times what people think someone else is wrong in, they may be wrong in that assessment, right? So then there has to be this kind of skill of deep self-assessment. But you see, if you have the buffer of the Bible, if the pastor is telling you not to be prideful, well, he's not just telling you, he's just reading from the scriptures. So there's a kind of buffer from that critique that allows you to dwell in it like a field and to think through it on your own time. The problem that you're describing is one of the things that religions and churches have had, not always, because then what ends up happening is you go to a different church. That's always the problem, right? Like, you're like, I don't like this. I'll go find a different one. And you get the splintering off of many denominations. And this is why Bonhoeffer's work is particularly interesting, because he is extremely interested in the problem of, well, why did the Lutheran German church fall into Nazism? What has happened to styles of confession? Bonhoeffer is particularly interesting for these questions. And basically, you have not seen a philosophical secular version of that problem. But basically, if we're going to talk about belonging again, something like that will have to be considered. So I think that's very well put. It will probably, you definitely have a language of private, public, membranic, wall. There are all these dimensions. But also, It requires, well, human beings, it's just Lacan, right? People don't like the real. Real is very difficult. And a lot of people, and also people also have certain tendencies of using dynamics of talking about problems or things that they see in other people to lift themselves up. And that becomes a problem, and actually can even happen in churches because pastors become the holy person who can tell you everything you need to do, and it slowly falls into a cult, right? So there are different problems here. Let me throw it back to you, Mr. Luber.
So like I think this actually has to do with content creation, like the world in which we're living in right now. Because if you go on TikTok, and I'm like actively trying to find, because every domain has a unique relationship to its theme. So like storytelling has its own relationship to theme. So like I believe like YouTube, how YouTube, the medium of YouTube content creation is done, has its own thematic disposition that when it's done correctly, bunch of views happen. Not saying like you need that, but I think it's hard to even find it, but I think it's a possibility. Anyway, my point is that with a lot of TikTok particularly, it seems like there's this tension where there's something like existentially real about the individual. Like there's something that they're not concealing at all. It's so raw and vulnerable that's present. And at the same time, there's always this other thing that's juxtaposing it. So give an example. There's this kid, he's pretty big and he's hilarious, but he also can't walk. He just can't walk. And like that's definitely something real here. I'm gonna put it in the group chat. But if you guys watch the video, he's like very flamboyant. He like his whole shtick is like, I don't even want to say shtick. I don't want to reduce him to a shtick because he's more than a shtick. But like he's dealing with something very real, and we're watching him dealing with something going through his everyday life, and he's juxtaposing it with some like joyous energy. And like that alone made him just big, where it's like he's not faking it. There's no faking, even though there's a tension that is contrary to him being crippled, essentially. Just because he's joyous about it, he's not faking the fact that he's crippled. So my point is that there's a certain like membraic, when you brought up that point with the difference between private and public, and you were talking about that, there's like a sweet spot where you're seeing something that would otherwise be private that is in the public, that is appropriate to be in the public and appropriate to be in the private. Whereas there's certain conversations that are not appropriate to be in the public at all, and that they need to be in the private. But so finding that sweet spot of where it's private and yet public at the same time, the possibility of public being appropriate at the same time, like there's something to that. Like I think like, you know, when you have people at the farm and you're just like, you know, you just have, all right, let's record, let's talk. Like there's something so raw and visceral about that. And like that is arguably private, but at the same time can be public. So like there's something to that makes social media what it is. Yeah.
No, I think that's very good. Well, you're always dealing with Lovecraft, with the craft in parentheses, right? There's always a danger where if you go too quickly or too much, Beatrice reduces Dante to ash, right? Basically, again, I think we've talked about it before. These are the kind of ground level problems that one of the things philosophies would benefit from respecting religions and theologies, because they're just full to the brim of these pastoral concerns, right? Like if someone in your congregation comes to you that's dealing with a gambling addiction or a drinking addiction or something, it would not be appropriate to call them out in front of everyone, right? Because it is hard enough to work through it. But then that if you have pastors who don't know how to shepherd someone through that issue and instead just moralizes, that creates all sort of problems as well, right? Oh, there's Reed. Hello, Mr. Reed. So there is skills of pathology, and also there is a certain thinking there that is radically personalized. And that's why pastors will also be like mega churches are problematic, right? Like there are individuals and individual circumstances that you could pour out, like you're like a church, a good pastor may like shepherd or, 20 people their entire life, right? Because that's what it requires. And it's private by virtue of being particular. That's kind of the issue. Like privacy and particularity goes up. It's simply you would not understand unless you were in that symbolic with that person, right? And so like it's the example Tyler was saying as well, like you have to be in that relationship to get that symbolic. And what ends up happening is if you make something public that ought to be private, actually the reason why that can cause so much trouble is because you're introducing to the world a symbolic that nobody but you get, and now the people feel like you've destroyed the intimacy. There's a certain betrayal. You've set them up to fail, basically, right? And so that's part of the issue, but that's all the thinking of pastoring versus just theology. There is a move here where philosophy has to think the difference between the teacher and the pastor, which say many religions have thought, not all of them and not even well. You can make an argument that what has destroyed a lot of Protestantism is the conflation of teacher and pastor, which has led to all sorts of pathologies, and you don't have different roles in different ministries. So it goes with philosophy. So these things have to be thought. I think also to the issue, and then alas, I will have to run here. I've enjoyed this quite a lot. There's always the question of if people online are using vulnerability to build a platform, right? If it's just kind of gamification. This is where the emphasis on vulnerability as surprise becomes more and more of an emphasis, right? Because you can't fake the surprise, right? And that's how you can also move from this kind of tension and ambiguity between what vulnerability are people using just to get votes and just to get a platform versus the vulnerability that you cannot prepare for, right? And that also is increasingly something that made some churches pathological, is to make vulnerability performative. I'm the worst of all. So people get up and talk about how terrible sinners they are, and that would actually give them brownie points. There are gamifications that can occur, right? So vulnerability has to be in the encounter. But of course, the encounter requires certain skills that various seminars or theological seminaries were not teaching, because they're actually more philosophical. But then the philosophical is not thinking the pastoral or the subject or the relational, right? So you have these massive disconnects that lead to these different problems and different things. I think also on these questions of also, I guess you could also say it's not going to happen unless the philosopher believes the particular is worth their time. If they are not going to emphasize the particular person in the particular encounter in the particular relationship and see that as worth their time, which you could argue is the psychoanalytical thrust of some philosophy today, or making relations ontological. There's all that push on the liminal web. Doing that could open it up. But then here's the trick. Any good pastor will tell you relationships are really, really hard, because you get all of people's baggage and what they're going through, and you try to be there for them, but you don't know their love language, so you misinterpret, and now there's hurt, and now there's gossip in the church of you being a bad pastor, and all these different things begin unfolding, right? So it is very, very difficult. We can talk all day about relations being ontological and the necessity of being there for one another, but without being able to think it, then it will probably not be, it will be more Lovecraftian than it is a love that moves the sun and stars. But this is where the thinking of potential is fundamental, of different symbolics and way of seeing being equally where real is really important. Because if you go into every relationship knowing that you need to discern and judge the particular symbolic that this particular relationship needs so that you can think it and encounter the creative possibility of the fundamental potential, well, then you will go in less likely to bulldoze people or to impress upon them a symbolic that doesn't help them, but actually leads to madness, as Korzybski would say, because that's usually, unfortunately, what occurs. The philosopher, if they're doing their role, I think, as the poet, as the religious, if we use those three from Hegel, is someone who actually is aware that not all symbolics apply equally to every situation. That, in fact, you need to be able to discern the best dimension by which to open up freedom here, by which people can organize themselves and have the best mental models, mental tools, best symbolics by which to organize what they are going through. And that symbolic that you make for Sarah may not apply to Robert. It may not apply to Bethany. It may not apply to anyone but that one person, that one person. But a good pastor is willing to do all that work for just one person in their congregation and maybe no one ever again. You know, Jesus has 12, right? So that sort of vulnerability to the possibility of doing a whole lot of work and a whole lot of thinking for one person, one sheep, as that parable goes, and no one else, that I think is the kind of willingness one has to have to start entering into the space of possibility that you are pointing out. And that's quite difficult. But if so, the final thing I would say is we've spoken about these points of groundlessness, these points of openness that don't fit the map, these points of destruction or things kind of breaking through, right? Well, those always have to be particular. They always have to be particular, almost by definition. The particular person you encounter, the particular event that you run into, that is the place that unveils that your map fails, and that's precisely where then a paradigm shift is possible, right? So if people are unwilling to go to that space that you're describing, Mr. Luber, then there's a high likelihood that whatever maps the philosophers are making will actually never encounter the anomalies or points of incompleteness that can open them to the new paradigms that are needed. And a way I think also just to kind of close is I think about those points of groundlessness, of the non-local, and also, Mr. Luber, Mr. Wolfgang Smith thinking on the instantaneousness of perception. Mr. Shinn said earlier that thinking is faster than light. Basically, if Stuart Kauffman is correct about non-locality being fundamental, we could say that time is faster than the speed of light, and that time is more durational than sequential, and what Wolfgang Smith would follow from the cosmology of a Stuart Kauffman, if he is correct, but maybe he's not. So, but it's a very interesting model that you could also bring in Lee Smolin, fundamental models of time, and you would also avoid some of the anomalies of quantum gravity that can't overcome itself and is leading to, multiverses and all these other fun things, and supersymmetry models that seem problematic. So Mr. Kauffman and Dr. Smith, I think, would go, well, Dr. Kauffman would go together quite well. But anyway, these points of failures, these points of the limits, the point of the girdle point, the point that it breaks, I do think that a way to think about those might be the creative potential, like what Walker Percy calls the delta effect. And the delta effect, which also could speak to these evolutions, it seems, of possible subjectivity or consciousness through history. Each one in an Owen Barfield or Steiner manner could be marked by a delta moment. And what the delta moment is, and for Mr. Percy, this moment must be considered if we're going to understand language, if we're going to understand human thinking, and we haven't looked at it enough. He looks at Helen Keller, and he says, let's look at Miss Keller. There was this moment where, after a whole lot of training, she realized that the water she felt on her hand was represented by the feeling in her hand. The symbolic was pointing to the phenomenon. Mr. Luber, good to see you, sir, and I'll believe you. There was a moment where the penny dropped and Helen Keller went, bam. The symbolic is pointing to the phenomenon. And so there was a radical paradigm shift instantaneously, just like that, as if it could have been no other way that occurred with Helen Keller. And Mr. Percy calls this I believe it's the delta factor, or the delta effect, this moment, and he has an essay in Message of the Bottle describing it. And he says, this right here is the secret to language. Right here is the secret to thinking, this really particular moment that doesn't really fit into any of our maps, and we really need to think this moment. Please note that this delta effect happened in a particular person at a particular time in a particular place that one had to encounter to then think. But this moment where, boom, suddenly the symbolic equals the phenomenon. And then what was crazy is, of course, Helen Keller very quickly adapted, very quickly started to be able to learn that these symbols in her hand, because he's deaf and blind, actually were symbolics, that the concept of symbol became meaningful to Miss Keller. So Mr. Percy is asking, the delta effect is this moment where there's the symbolic is now meaningful. The symbolic means something, which of course means that the human subjectivity can participate creatively in reality in a way that otherwise would be foreclosed. You would be closed off to. So there was some moment, Mr. Percy ends his little essay saying, imagine that moment where the cavemen were sitting around the fire, and one thinks about E.O. Wilson, the social kind of, where all of these different people, they're sitting around the fire, and there was this one moment where language started, and people realized that symbolics could point to phenomenons, right? Now, of course, I'm not saying this is the official history of language or anything. He's just making a point that there's this delta effect moment that occurs that then changes the entire horizon of possibility in reality for the human subject. What if more of those could exist in different ways that we can't imagine? What if actually there are more points that we can encounter that bring with them some sort of a delta effect that would open up creative possibilities that we could not know otherwise? Well, The only way to find out is to keep doing the work of maps and look for that point where they fail, to keep doing that point where we find the groundlessness and the deconstruction, because it's precisely in that moment where you realize, hey, the way that I was organizing in life was missing something. It was missing this delta effect, which you first experience as a certain groundlessness, agitate. Helen Keller is getting agitated. So he's getting angry. Like there's this anxiety. What are you guys trying to show me? This doesn't make sense. Angry, dropping napkin, just really, and then bam, delta effect. So I think that's part of the work, is to keep doing the work of these models and these relationships to find these points of incompletion. So the delta effect. So the delta effect changes the quality, not just the quantity, the quality of interaction with the life, the quality by which you interact with, right? And I think that's a lot of what we can realize if we go, oh, these symbolics are actually, these maps are helping us find these points where something breaks and thus a new quality can come forth. That if it never came forth, we would also never know that it didn't come forth. But once it does come forth, it changes the quality by which we interact with all things. And if that's always possible, if there's always the possibility of that, because potentiality is fundamental, because human beings can see things so differently, then there's a reason to be enchanted. We just have to continue with the work. But with that, I've enjoyed this immensely. Thank you all for being here. It's been a treat. Have a wonderful day. All the best. Thank you all.